The Leased Estates of Meryton, Jarmo Palamaki. Chapter 1. The fire crackled merrily in Darcy's drawing room, casting a warm glow on the polished mahogany and the serious spines of countless books. Outside, the perpetual London drizzle had settled in for the afternoon. Inside, however, the atmosphere was one of congenial ease, as Charles Bingley, a man whose cheerful countenance could banish any gloom, reclined in an armchair opposite his host. "Darcy, my dear fellow, it's good to see you away from those tiresome ledgers," Bingley declared, taking a generous sip of sherry. "I swear your office could rival a monastery for its solemnity." Darcy, a man not prone to effusive displays, allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Business, Bingley, is often a solemn affair, though I confess I prefer my own study to Mr. Davies's." "Ah, Davies," Bingley mused, "a formidable man, but entirely trustworthy. He handled my last property transaction with admirable discretion. Speaking of which, I find myself with a rather inconvenient surplus of leisure lately. My city house, while perfectly adequate, feels confining. I've been considering a country escape, perhaps a lease for a change of air." Darcy set down his own glass, his gaze thoughtful. "It is a curious coincidence, then, that I might have precisely what you require. A rather charming estate, in Hertfordshire as it happens, has recently come to my attention. The current occupant has moved abroad unexpectedly, leaving the house and grounds in impeccable order." Bingley's face lit up. "Hertfordshire, you say? Excellent. Not too far from London, but far enough for proper rural pursuits. Tell me more. What is its name? And the owner, are they reasonable?" Darcy hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "The estate is called Netherfield Park. As for the owner, they have expressed a strong desire to remain anonymous. They value their privacy above all else and wish no direct contact with any potential lessee." Bingley's enthusiasm, though momentarily checked, did not wane entirely. "Anonymous? That is unusual, but if the terms are fair and the house agreeable, I see no immediate impediment. Still, one does prefer to know with whom one is dealing." "You would be dealing with them through precisely the same solicitor who manages your own affairs, Bingley," Darcy clarified, his voice firm. "Mr. Davies himself would draw up the contract and manage all negotiations. He assures me the proprietor is entirely reputable, merely disinclined to public notice. Your interests, I can guarantee, would be fully protected." Bingley considered this, tapping a finger against his chin. He trusted Darcy implicitly, and Mr. Davies was indeed a man of unimpeachable character. "Well, if Davies is in charge of the particulars, that sets my mind at ease considerably. Anonymity is perhaps a small price to pay for a pleasant country seat. Netherfield Park, you say? I like the sound of it already. I believe I shall take it. It would be delightful to have a place to truly settle for a season or two." A faint, almost imperceptible shift in Darcy's posture suggested a quiet satisfaction. "Excellent. I shall instruct Davies to proceed with the arrangements immediately." Bingley clapped his hands together, his smile infectious. "Wonderful! And when it's all settled, Darcy, you must come and stay. You'll be my first guest. We can ride, shoot, and escape the oppressive society of London altogether. What do you say?" Darcy nodded slowly. "I confess the prospect is appealing, and convenient, as it happens. I find I shall have some other business to attend to in Hertfordshire myself in the coming weeks. So yes, Bingley, I should be delighted to accept your invitation." Bingley beamed, oblivious to the deeper calculations behind his friend's agreement. "Splendid! This will be capital. A new adventure and you by my side. I foresee a most agreeable change of scenery." Darcy merely inclined his head, a private amusement playing about his lips. A change of scenery, indeed, and perhaps a change of fortune, for them both. Chapter 2. The carriage, a model of quiet elegance, not ostentation, drew up the gravel drive of Netherfield Park. Charles Bingley, a picture of youthful exuberance, practically danced on the grand portico, his welcoming smile wide and genuine. He had pictured his dearest friend, Fitzwilliam Darcy, arriving in the peak of London fashion, perhaps a touch more severe than his own preference, but undeniably a man of immense consequence. When the footman opened the door, what emerged was, to Bingley's considerable surprise, quite different. Darcy stepped down, not in the rich velvets or intricately embroidered waistcoats Bingley had anticipated, but in a plain, though impeccably tailored, suit of dark broadcloth. His cravat was neatly tied but unadorned, his boots polished but without the fashionable gleam of a man accustomed to endless leisure. His presence, though commanding, was devoid of the usual ostentation that accompanied a man of his standing. He looked, in short, like a solvent, respectable gentleman of good breeding, but in no way did he appear to be one of the wealthiest men in England. Bingley's smile faltered, a bewildered frown creasing his brow. "Darcy, my dear fellow," he exclaimed, hurrying forward to clasp his friend's hand. "You are here at last. But, I must confess, I had not quite expected, that is to say, your attire is rather subdued." He gestured vaguely at Darcy's simple clothes, then at the opulent sweep of Netherfield's facade, a stark contrast. Darcy offered a rare, almost imperceptible smile, a flash of insight in his usually serious eyes. "You expected a grander display, perhaps, Charles? A more overt declaration of my position?" "Well, no, not a declaration exactly," Bingley stammered, a blush rising on his fair cheeks. "But given your usual taste and the expectations one has of a gentleman of your consequence, this is rather provincial, if I may be so bold." Darcy allowed himself to be led into the magnificent entrance hall, his gaze sweeping over the polished marble and ornate furnishings. "It is deliberately so, Bingley," he confirmed, his voice low and deliberate. "I have grown weary of being perceived first as a fortune, and only then perhaps as a man. The endless calculations, the veiled inquiries into my properties, the subtle angling for advantage that follows me like a shadow." He paused, his gaze meeting Bingley's. "I am tired of it, Charles, truly tired." Bingley's brow furrowed in confusion. "But what does your choice of clothing have to do with this weariness?" "Everything," Darcy stated, a hint of steel entering his tone. "I have decided to present myself here in Meryton not as Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley, but simply as a gentleman of moderate, though respectable means. A man who, while comfortable enough, is hardly a catch for those whose primary ambition in life is to marry well, in the purely financial sense." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping further. "My aim, Charles, is to protect myself against mercenary attachments, to filter out those who would attach themselves to wealth rather than to character. In this guise, I believe it will become infinitely easier to discern who are true friends, who are genuinely interested in the man beneath the veneer, and who are merely interested in the size of my estate or the depth of my coffers." Bingley listened, wide-eyed, a slow understanding dawning on his face. "So you wish to test people? To see if they like you for you?" "Precisely. And to do so effectively, my true circumstances must remain absolutely, unequivocally unknown. This is vital, Bingley. What I ask of you is a matter of the utmost discretion. Not one word, Charles, not a single syllable, about my wealth, my properties, or my true position in society must be breathed to anyone in this neighborhood. Not to your sisters, not to your acquaintances, not to the local gentry, nor the ladies of Meryton. Is that understood?" Darcy's gaze was intense, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Bingley, though a little overwhelmed by the gravity of his friend's request, nodded vigorously. "Understood, Darcy, completely. Not a word. I swear it on my honor." A mischievous grin began to spread across his face. "It will be quite an adventure, won't it? A grand social experiment." Darcy allowed himself a rare, genuine smile, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "Perhaps, or perhaps it will merely confirm my lowest estimations of human nature. But at least," he added, looking out toward the distant rolling hills, "at least for once I shall know, and for once I shall be judged for myself, and not for my inheritance or my ancestral acres." Chapter 3. The large drawing room at Longbourn, usually a sanctuary for Mr. Bennet's quiet study, was today animated by the agreeable, if slightly high-pitched, chatter of Mrs. Bennet and her daughters, and the robust, cheerful presence of Mr. Bingley. "Indeed, Mr. Bennet," Bingley clarified, his face shining with the enthusiasm of a man embarking on a grand, slightly ill-conceived adventure. "I have taken Netherfield not merely for the sport, delightful as that promises to be, but as a practical education. My uncle always insisted that true wealth lies in land, properly managed. I intend to prove myself capable of that management, starting here in Hertfordshire. It is, you see, a schoolroom with a very fine lake." Mr. Bennet lifted a satirical eyebrow from behind his newspaper. "A schoolroom, Mr. Bingley? Well, if your desire is simply to pay a substantial sum for the privilege of learning how much rain a good roof can bear, I applaud your modern commitment to experiential tuition." He then fixed his gaze on Mr. Darcy, who stood with an air of severe patience near the mantelpiece, looking as though the very furniture was beneath his notice. "Mr. Darcy, your presence is an altogether different matter," Mr. Bennet observed, his tone growing sharper. "Mr. Bingley's motives, though perhaps romantically optimistic, are clear. But you, sir, you cannot be here, surely, for the sake of improving your knowledge of muck and manure. Why, truly, have you traveled so far?" A sudden, almost palpable silence fell over the room. Even Mrs. Bennet paused in her whispered conjectures about the price of muslin. Darcy shifted, his composed exterior showing a flicker of unwelcome constraint. He disliked explaining professional duties in a social setting, particularly one so frivolous. But Mr. Bennet's directness demanded an honest utility. "I am present, sir, for two distinct reasons," Darcy replied, his voice deep and measured. "The first is, as you observe, friendship. Bingley is amiable, but occasionally lacks foresight. I wish to ensure his initial steps into the agricultural world were not entirely ruinous." He paused, glancing involuntarily toward Bingley, whose smile had dimmed slightly at the word ruinous. "The second reason," Darcy continued, facing Mr. Bennet directly, "is a matter of unwelcome duty. I have been sent here by the proprietors of the large tracts of leased land in this county, including Netherfield Park, and indeed many smaller plots throughout the Meryton area." Mr. Bennet leaned forward, folding his paper neatly. "An envoy, then? I confess, Mr. Darcy, I did not mistake you for a casual tourist. Pray, what intelligence does your embassy carry?" Darcy's tone hardened, adopting the formal register of a man delivering official notice. "The ownership of these leased estates, which has been under the quiet administration of trustees for so many years, is changing hands. The new owner is moving immediately to streamline and review all existing contracts." He drew a breath, the severity of the news requiring absolute clarity. "My instruction is to warn all current tenants, including Mr. Bingley, that the existing agreements hold only for the duration of the current term, which will close precisely 1 year from this coming Michaelmas." A gasp was heard from the far end of the room, perhaps Miss Jane, though it might have been Mrs. Bennet. "Furthermore," Darcy pressed on, his eyes holding Mr. Bennet's, "I am tasked with notifying all leaseholders that the new proprietor is demanding immediate and total payment of all unpaid rents and outstanding financial commitments accumulated during the tenure of the previous administration. They will be due in full within a year." The implications of this were immense. Many smaller gentlemen farmers, and even some established families, often lag slightly on yearly rents, relying on the leniency of the distant trustees. The demand for immediate full settlement would surely cause acute distress. "And the future?" Mr. Bennet inquired, his voice low, betraying a flicker of true concern now, overriding his amusement. "What provision is made for those who wish to remain?" "That is the most rigorous condition, sir," Darcy stated. "The new proprietor is determined to eradicate mismanagement and reclaim profitability. After the debt review, there will be a thorough assessment of the condition of every estate. Only those who can demonstrate competent, prudent management, who have maintained the land, improved the infrastructure, and demonstrated sound fiscal responsibility, will be offered the possibility of a lease renewal. All others will find their contracts terminated at the 1-year mark." Mr. Bennet leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together slowly. He looked from the imposing figure of Darcy to the suddenly sober face of Bingley. "Well, Mr. Darcy," he said finally, a ghost of his usual amused cynicism returning, though tinged with serious contemplation. "I begin to see why you are not merely a decorative fixture in this county. You are, in effect, the sword of Damocles, dangling over the heads of every gentleman who has suffered a leaky roof without bothering to mend it. It seems the pleasant social calendar of Meryton is about to be interrupted by a serious outbreak of bookkeeping." Chapter 4. The air in the Longbourn drawing room was thick with the scent of spent ambition and damp wool, after the hasty departure of Mr. Bingley and his formidable friend. Elizabeth, resting by the fire, watched the flickering light play across the settled gloom of her father's face. She was tired of speculation, but the social whirlwind had stirred up fundamental questions about the nature of property and settlement. "Sir," Elizabeth began, folding her embroidery, "what is this talk about leased estates? Can you explain?" Mr. Bennet hesitated, then delivered the blow with the cynical satisfaction of a man revealing a decades-old fatal joke. "My dear, excellent Elizabeth, the foundation of our entire neighborhood is far more precarious than even your mother's anxieties about the entail could suggest. Longbourn is not ours. Netherfield, Lucas Lodge, practically all estates around Meryton, they all rest upon the same unstable contract." He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "We are all, Lizzie, merely tenants." Elizabeth blinked. The idea was absurd, yet delivered with such conviction by her father, it demanded belief. "Tenants, sir? For how long has my family leased this estate?" "Ah, there is the crux of the matter. The contracts were established long, long ago, shortly after the turn of the last century. 100-year lease, renewable but binding. The original agreement was so extensive, so lengthy, that the subsequent generations simply forgot they were not proprietors. They acted as owners, built as owners, lived and died as owners. But the contracts remain, and the rent, Lizzie, was due. But surely, sir, if the lease has passed from grandfather to father to son, it is settled. We have lived here always. Settled, yes, in custom, but not in law. The initial proprietor, some shadowy, ambitious landowner, whose heirs moved overseas or into greater business, was lost to us. They were satisfied to establish the leases and then simply vanished from English concern." Mr. Bennet ran a hand over his tired face. "For the first few decades, the rents were paid meticulously to an appointed solicitor. Then the solicitor died, the proprietor ceased replying to correspondence, and war intervened. 80 years ago, Lizzie, the payments dwindled and then completely stopped. The tenants, my grandfather, my father, and I, simply held the estates, paying only the local rates and taxes, assuming the proprietor was either wealthy enough to forget us or dead enough to permit it." Elizabeth felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was not the entail, a distant, theoretical threat. This was their very home. "And now?" she whispered. "Now," Mr. Bennet said, the theatrical lightness gone, replaced by profound dread. "The heirs have reappeared, entirely unexpectedly, and armed with the full weight of the law, a meticulous bookkeeping of 80 years of arrears, compounded interest, and a demand for immediate settlement." He pushed a heavy packet of documents across the table. They were crisp, official, and wholly terrifying. "The owner, or rather, the owner's representative, has given us 1 calendar year to settle the entire debt which accrues to the Longbourn tenancy. If we fail, the lease is forfeit, and the family is required to vacate. Immediately." Elizabeth picked up the documents, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the precise legal terminology. The years of neglect, the accumulated sum, Mr. Bennet must have known this was mathematically impossible. "The amount, Papa," she said, her voice strained. "A debt of 80 years. It must be colossal." "It is," he agreed soberly. "It is an utter fortune. Far more than any neighboring estate's net worth, perhaps more than the Bingley fortune entire, were it to be liquidated solely for this purpose. Even if I sold every scrap of non-entailed land, the horses and mortgage the entirety of our income for the rest of my days, we would acquire perhaps 1/5 of the demand. And we are the fortunate ones, Lizzie. Others are in ruin." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the familiar sweep of the gravel drive, which suddenly felt incredibly fragile. like a stage set, ready to collapse. Netherfield too? She asked, thinking of Bingley's cheerful, careless confidence, built on rented ground. Netherfield is in the same peril, though perhaps the Bingley fortune, being new and liquid, has a better chance of meeting the demands than the accumulated debt of an established tenant like Sir William Lucas. The silence that followed was profound, the cheerful, petty worries of Meryton receding into insignificance. The financial crisis was not a vague threat of future poverty, but an immediate, unavoidable catastrophe that threatened to render the entire Bennet family, plus half the local gentry, homeless within a year. Elizabeth turned back to her father, her shock giving way to a fierce practical resolve. The lightness of their existence had been stripped away. "Then, Papa," she said, gripping the papers tightly, "we must stop speaking of securing a good marriage. For a good marriage will not purchase 80 years of debt. We must speak of finding this fortune, or appealing to this new proprietor. We must speak of survival." Mr. Bennet looked at his favorite daughter, seeing in her serious, clear eyes not fear, but a frightening intelligence roused to action. He offered a weak, ironic smile. "Ah, Lizzie, I always knew it would fall to you to manage the consequences of my negligence. Congratulations. You now have a genuine crisis to occupy your excellent mind." Chapter 5. The fire crackled merrily in the grand drawing room of Netherfield Park, doing little to dispel the serious atmosphere that clung about Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. He was seated at a heavy mahogany table, sorting through correspondence that related less to social calls and more to complex legal entailments, while Mr. Bingley, utterly oblivious to the heavier burdens of estate management, was discussing the merits of a new spaniel. A gentle tap preceded the entrance of a footman, whose starched collar seemed to vibrate with the importance of his announcement. "A visitor, sir," the footman declared, bowing toward Darcy. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." Darcy rose, his movements measured and precise, though a flicker of surprise crossed his features. Elizabeth Bennet calling upon him directly was highly unusual. Elizabeth entered, dressed plainly, though her usual spirits shone in the quick glance she cast around the room. Her bearing was less buoyant than usual. She carried herself with a quiet, almost desperate dignity. "Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy," she greeted them, accepting Bingley's effusive welcome politely before turning her full attention to the master of Pemberley. Bingley, sensing the gravitas of her manner, quickly offered refreshment and then, with endearing tactlessness, declared, "I shall just step out. Do not let me interrupt any serious conversation." He vanished, leaving Darcy and Elizabeth alone amidst the heavy velvet in polished silver. Elizabeth did not waste time with further preamble. She took the seat Darcy indicated, drawing a breath that was too loud for polite society. "Mr. Darcy, I must beg your indulgence for this intrusion," she began, her eyes meeting his steadily, despite the faint tremor in her voice. "My purpose here is entirely professional, though exceedingly delicate, and I assure you I would not trespass upon your time if the necessity were not so dire." Darcy merely inclined his head, waiting. "It concerns the long-standing arrears owed by my father and several of the smaller neighboring estates," she continued, speaking quickly, as if to outrun her own embarrassment. "Those who lease the land belonging to the owner, whom you represent, have fallen into deep, crippling debt. Years of unpaid leasing fees have accumulated to an unbearable sum." She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "My family is sadly amongst the worst affected. I understand fully that debt is debt, and that the leaseholder is liable. However, the amounts now demanded are utterly ruinous. We cannot possibly meet them. I came to ask on behalf of these families if there might be any possible means for the total sum to be reduced. Could the interest be waived or the principal reduced to a manageable level, allowing us time to recover?" The silence that followed was heavy, disturbed only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn, convinced she had overstepped the bounds of decency. Darcy watched her, his expression unreadable, though it lacked the previous sharpness usually reserved for those who annoyed him. "Miss Elizabeth," he finally said, his voice low and serious, "I am glad you came. I understand the severity of the situation far better than you might imagine. He leaned forward slightly. The owner of these estates, who I must maintain, wishes to remain anonymous, though I act entirely as his agent in managerial and financial matters, is fully aware of the desperate plight of the tenants. It has been a complex problem, worsened by the previous agent's laxity in collection, which merely allowed the debts to metastasize. Elizabeth's heart sank. She braced herself for a polite but firm refusal. You ask if the debt can be reduced to a manageable level, Darcy continued, and I must give you a firm answer. Legally, Miss Elizabeth, that is impossible. Once a debt is recorded and authenticated, it must by law be either paid or discharged. We cannot simply have the figures on the ledger. Elizabeth's hopeful expectation dissolved into crushing disappointment. She stood to leave, ready to thank him coldly for his time. However, Darcy said, stopping her retreat. His tone had changed, acquiring an almost unexpected warmth. The owner does not wish to ruin good families due to past misfortunes. He wishes to secure a prosperous tenancy for the future, not widespread pauperism. He walked to the desk, selecting a clean sheet of heavy paper. The owner has authorized a radical measure, understanding that reduction alone is insufficient to save the estates from collapse. It is not a reduction you should seek, Miss Elizabeth. It is a full release. Elizabeth stared at him, unable to process the words. A full release? Precisely. The owner recognizes that the tenants are, in fact, victims of circumstance and poor management. He has prepared a mechanism for total absolution of these long-accumulated arrears for all affected leaseholders. Darcy returned to her side, holding the paper. It is impossible to simply void the debt universally without inviting chaos. Therefore, the owner requires a formal declaration of intent. Every leaseholder who wishes to be entirely released from their arrears, from the very first pound owed, must submit a written application for debt relief to his solicitor, Mr. Davies, in London. He placed the paper on the table before her. This is a simple declaration of circumstance and a plea for clemency. It must be written formally, dated, and signed by the head of the leaseholding household. Once received by Mr. Davies, the debt against that estate will be discharged entirely from the ledger, making the tenant solvent and free of all former encumbrances. Elizabeth felt a wave of dizziness. The future of Longbourn lifted in one extraordinary pronouncement. This is an act of impossible generosity, Mr. Darcy, she whispered. It is an act of prudent necessity, Miss Elizabeth, he corrected gently, but it comes with a critical caveat. This offer is extraordinary and cannot be maintained indefinitely, lest other debtors demand similar treatment. I do not know the exact window of opportunity, but I was instructed to make this offer known and stress that applications must be sent to Mr. Davies as a matter of the utmost urgency. He looked at her pointedly. You came to ask for a reduction. I offer you salvation, but you must act immediately. Inform your father and inform the other affected families in the neighborhood. They must write these letters and dispatch them to London without delay. Elizabeth stood, her composure finally breaking into genuine, overwhelming emotion. Mr. Darcy, I do not know how to express the depth of the relief you have just granted to entire families. You need not thank me, Miss Elizabeth. You need only act quickly, he reiterated, his serious dark eyes holding hers. The solvency of your family and the stability of your neighborhood rests upon the speed of the post. She nodded once, retrieving her gloves with trembling hands. It shall be done immediately. I shall ride home directly. As she hurried toward the door, her spirit renewed with urgent purpose, Bingley reappeared, beaming. All well, Lizzie? You look quite flushed. Quite well, Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth confirmed, a dazzling, genuine smile finally breaking through. Indeed, everything is perfectly, wonderfully well. And with a final, charged look at Mr. Darcy, a look of profound respect, she rushed out to secure the future of Longbourn. Chapter 6. The oak-paneled library at Longbourn, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation for Mr. Bennet, was abruptly invaded. Elizabeth burst in, her cheeks flushed with an unusual vibrancy, her bonnet slightly askew, her eyes, typically sparkling with wit, now shone with a startling mixture of disbelief and elation. Mr. Bennet, engrossed in his latest volume of sermons, a diversion he often claimed was meant to improve his mind, though his daughters suspected it was merely to escape. Theirs barely looked up from behind his spectacles. "Papa," Elizabeth exclaimed, her voice a shade higher than usual, "I have just had the most astonishing conversation. With Mr. Darcy." Mr. Bennet sighed, marking his page with a long, thin finger. "Darcy, you say? Has he finally confessed to having a more disagreeable temper than any man in England, and wishes to be commended for his honesty?" Elizabeth, however, was not to be deterred by his customary cynicism. She paced the worn Persian rug before his desk, her hands clasped tightly. "No, Papa, quite the contrary. He has told me something that, oh, it is almost too good to be true, and yet I believe him entirely." Mr. Bennet slowly lowered his book. The unusual earnestness in Elizabeth's tone pierced through his usual indifference. "Indeed? And what impossible feat has Mr. Darcy achieved now? Has he convinced the Prince Regent to read a serious book?" "It concerns Longbourn, Papa," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping slightly, now tinged with a more serious note. And the debt." At the mention of the debt, a subtle tremor passed through Mr. Bennet's habitually serene features. It was a word rarely spoken aloud in the family, a dark, lingering shadow over their precarious existence, the accumulated arrears from generations of deferred leasing payments, a burden that had grown heavier with each passing year, threatening to consume them entirely. "What of it?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp, devoid of its usual ironic lilt. "Has Darcy discovered a new legal loophole to hasten our eviction?" "No, no, Papa, quite the opposite." Elizabeth hurried to his side, leaning on the desk. He says that the debt, the entire debt due to unpaid leasing payments over many, many years, can be canceled." Mr. Bennet blinked, his expression a mixture of profound skepticism and dawning hope. He removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Canceled? My dear Elizabeth, are you quite well? Has Mr. Darcy been indulging in too much of his own excellent port?" "He was perfectly sober and perfectly serious, Papa," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "He explained that the debt can be forgiven. All of it." Mr. Bennet stared at her, his lips parting slightly. This was beyond belief. Years of financial anxiety, years of seeing his estate slowly slip through his fingers. Could it truly vanish? "And what is the catch?" he asked, his voice strained. "Mr. Darcy, for all his virtues, is not known for acts of spontaneous charity." Elizabeth hesitated. "There is a condition, Papa. A simple one," he says. "You must make a formal written application and send it to Solicitor Davies in London. Mr. Darcy provided me with the full name and address." Mr. Bennet slumped back in his chair, running a hand over his thinning hair. A formal written application. That sounded like effort. That sounded like engagement with a world he preferred to ignore. Yet the alternative, the quick, inevitable fall into poverty for his family, the prospect of his daughters left homeless and dependent. He looked at Elizabeth, her eyes shining with an almost desperate hope. She, more than any of his daughters, understood the precariousness of their situation. She, who would have to bear the brunt of their financial ruin, was now offering him a lifeline. "A formal written application, you say," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "To Davies, in London. It sounds implausible, Lizzie." "Utterly so. Why would a man, particularly one of Darcy's standing, bother with such a thing for me?" "He said it was a matter of rectifying an old oversight, Papa," Elizabeth supplied, knowing it was a white lie to protect Darcy's true motives and perhaps her own feelings. "He believes it is the right thing to do, and if it is true, Papa, imagine. No more worries about the future. Longbourn secured. A fresh start for all of us." The weight of her words, the fervent hope in her eyes, resonated deeply within him. Mr. Bennet was a man of indolence and irony, but he was not without love for his daughters, nor without a deep-seated, if often unspoken, fear for their future. The debt was a constant gnawing worry that he usually masked with sardonic detachment. To have it gone. He picked up his spectacles again, slowly replacing them on his nose, his gaze distant. "It strains credulity, Lizzie," he said, his voice softer now, less dismissive. "A debt of so many years simply erased. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale. And Mr. Darcy is no fairy godmother." "But what if it is true, Papa?" Elizabeth countered gently. "What have we to lose by trying? A few hours of your time, a sheet of paper, a stamp." Compared to the alternative, the silence in the library stretched, punctuated only by the distant caw of a rook. Mr. Bennet looked from his daughter's hopeful face to the dusty shelves filled with books that offered little solace to real-world problems. He thought of his wife's ceaseless anxieties, his younger daughter's thoughtless extravagance, and the quiet, desperate future that loomed for them all. He let out a long, slow breath. "Very well, Lizzie," he said, pushing his spectacles further up his nose. A flicker of something akin to awe, mixed with disbelief, played in his eyes. "Fetch me the good quill and a fresh sheet of paper, and you may dictate the particulars. I hardly believe a word of it, of course, but it is worth trying." And in that moment, a sliver of unexpected hope, fragile but real, began to illuminate the shadowed corners of Longbourn. Chapter 7. The spring air in Hertfordshire, usually a balm to Elizabeth Bennet's spirits, felt thick and heavy with unspoken anxieties. She had ridden out from Longbourn with a lightness in her heart, carrying news that should have been met with jubilation. She had heard good news from Mr. Darcy about the possibility to get debt cancellation due to years of unpaid leasing. It was a chance for a fresh start, for prosperity, for release from a financial stranglehold. Her first stop was the estate of the Kings, a sensible and respected couple who managed a modest but well-kept property. She found Mrs. King tending to her rose bushes, her hands stained with soil, a faint frown etched between her brows. "Good morning, Mrs. King," Elizabeth called out cheerfully, dismounting her horse. "I bring you the most wonderful news." Mrs. King straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Elizabeth, my dear, what good news can there be on such a dreary morn?" "Dreary? On the contrary, I have heard from Mr. Darcy himself as the representative of the owner of the possibility for a complete cancellation. Imagine, Mrs. King, no more worrying about those old debts. A clean slate." Elizabeth expected a gasp, a flutter of relief, perhaps even tears of gratitude. Instead, Mrs. King's frown deepened. "Cancellation? Mr. Darcy, I am afraid I do not understand, Elizabeth." "The unpaid leasing can be forgiven," Elizabeth explained, her own smile faltering at the unexpected lack of enthusiasm. "It is a most generous gesture." Mrs. King shook her head slowly. "Generous? Or another of Mr. Darcy's clever tricks?" Elizabeth's jaw dropped. "Tricks? Mrs. King, he is a man of impeccable character." "Character?" Mrs. King's voice lowered, and she glanced around as if fearful of being overheard. "We have heard different tales, child, tales of trickery, not generosity. And even his clothes confirm that he cannot be a rich gentleman. Tales that Mr. Darcy is no true representative of the owner, but a usurper. That the true owner died many years ago, and these lands, practically, belong to those who work them." A chill, unrelated to the springtime air, slithered down Elizabeth's spine. "That is preposterous. Where did you hear such a thing?" "From a man who knows the truth," Mrs. King said, her eyes hardening. "A man named Mr. Wickham." The name hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Mr. Wickham, the charming, silver-tongued officer who had recently been stationed in Meryton, the man Elizabeth had initially found so agreeable, and whose stories she now recalled with a sickening lurch, involved ill treatment and betrayal at the hands of Mr. Darcy. "Mr. Wickham?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "He travels amongst us," Mrs. King continued, her tone earnest, convincing. "He tells us Mr. Darcy is merely a steward with no claim to these lands, that the owner's will was suppressed, and that we, the tenants, are practically the rightful inheritors. He says Mr. Darcy's claims are false, designed to extort further payments before we realize our true freedom." Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. The carefully constructed edifice of her good news crumbled around her. She had envisioned faces lit with relief, grateful whispers, a ripple of hope spreading through the leased communities. Instead, she found suspicion, distrust, and the insidious poison of Wickham's lies. Her next visits were no better. At the smaller, more struggling tenant farms, the reaction was the same. They spoke of Mr. Wickham with a reverence usually reserved for saints or saviors. He had painted Mr. Darcy as a villain, a deceiver who sought to maintain a false claim over lands that should be theirs. He had promised them permanent possession, freedom from rent, freedom from debt, all by simply disbelieving any representative of a phantom owner. "He said Mr. Darcy's promises are just another way to bind us," a farmer named Silas told her, his calloused hands twisting a piece of straw. "He says Darcy wants us to believe we owe him something before we realize we owe him nothing at all, that the owner is long gone and the land is ours to keep, as Mr. Wickham has assured us." Elizabeth tried to reason with them, to appeal to their sense, to the obvious lack of logic in Wickham's claims. She spoke of legal documents, of rightful ownership, of Darcy's reputation, but against the compelling narrative of freedom and inherent possessions spun by the charismatic Wickham, her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, muffled by years of hardship and the intoxicating allure of an easy solution. She learned that Wickham had been systematically visiting these estates for days, sowing seeds of dissent and rebellion. He had cleverly framed Darcy's offer of debt cancellation not as a benevolence, but as a shrewd trap. If they accepted the cancellation, they would implicitly acknowledge Darcy's authority and their ongoing obligation. By refusing and by believing Wickham, they held on to the hope of ultimate ownership of an inheritance that was not theirs. As Elizabeth rode back towards Longbourn, the sun now breaking through the clouds, its warmth seemed to mock her efforts. The good news she carried had curdled into a bitter draught, poisoned by the machinations of a man she had once so readily trusted. Mr. Wickham, with his artful lies, had not only damaged Darcy's reputation, but had also stolen the very hope she had intended to bestow. The tenants, desperate for relief, had latched onto a dangerous fantasy. A fantasy that promised them everything, while leading them towards a potentially ruinous reality. Elizabeth realized with a heavy heart that the greatest obstacle to good news was not its absence, but its manipulation, and Mr. Wickham had proven himself a master of that cruel art. Chapter 8. The air at Longbourn had been thick with an unspoken anxiety for 4 days. Mr. Bennet, usually impervious to the petty squabbles and nervous complaints that animated his wife, had worn a subtle but discernible furrow in his brow. The family knew without needing a direct pronouncement that the application to Solicitor Davies regarding their outstanding leasing debts was the cause of his unusual solemnity. Mrs. Bennet, though often prone to exaggerated hysterics, had kept her more pronounced lamentations at bay, her own nerves quietly fraying beneath a veneer of forced composure. Even the girls, usually bustling with youthful energy, moved with a subdued grace, their eyes frequently straying to their father, silently pleading for a reprieve they knew he too awaited. On the morning of the 5th day, just as the family was concluding their breakfast, a footman entered the dining room. "A dispatch from London, sir," he announced, holding out a sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet took the letter, his hand momentarily hesitating before breaking the wax seal. He unfolded the single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, his gaze sweeping over the elegant script. The room fell silent. Mrs. Bennet gripped the edge of the table, her breath caught in her throat. Jane and Elizabeth exchanged a worried glance, while Kitty and Lydia, sensing the gravity of the moment, stilled their chatter. Mr. Bennet read the missive once, then again, a slow, disbelieving smile beginning to form on his lips, displacing the deep lines of worry that had resided there for days. His customary sarcastic twinkle was replaced by something softer, a profound relief. "Well, my dear," he said, and his voice held a lightness that had been absent. "It seems Solicitor Davies has provided us with an answer." Mrs. Bennet could bear the suspense no longer. And pray tell, Mr. Bennet, what news? Are we to be ruined? Are we to be turned out of Longbourn? He chuckled softly, a rare, genuine sound. Quite the opposite, my dear. It is remarkable. He held up the paper, though too far for them to read the specifics. It is a certificate, quite short, but impressively worded. It states, he paused, allowing the words to sink in for himself before sharing them, that for all debts due to unpaid leasing, up to the end of the current leasing period next year, they are canceled. Silence, profound and absolute, fell upon the room, thicker than before. Then Mrs. Bennet let out a gasp that was half sob, half laugh, pushing herself from the table. Canceled? Did you say canceled? All of them? Mr. Bennet nodded, a wide, beatific smile now fixed upon his face. All of them, up to the end of next year, a clean slate, for the time being at least, regarding this particular burden. The dam broke. Mrs. Bennet burst into tears of overwhelming relief, rushing to embrace her husband, something she rarely did with such spontaneous affection. Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet, you are the best of men. My poor nerves. I knew we would be saved. I just knew it. Jane, ever composed, had tears in her own eyes as she came forward to hug her father, her voice choked with emotion. Elizabeth, usually too pragmatic for such displays, felt a knot in her stomach unravel, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. She exchanged a radiant smile with Jane, then with her father. Kitty and Lydia, at first bewildered, quickly understood the magnitude of the news and joined the throng, their youthful cries of delight adding to the joyful cacophony. The certificate lay discarded on the table, a humble piece of paper holding the weight of a monumental release. The cloud that had hung over Longbourn had vanished, replaced by sunshine. The prospect of ruin had been averted, at least for a blessed period. A weight lifted not just from Mr. Bennet's shoulders, but from the entire household. That day, the small, unassuming certificate of cancellation transformed Longbourn into a haven of pure, unadulterated joy, a happiness that sparkled in every laugh and shimmered in every tear. The tea that followed was the sweetest they had tasted in years. Chapter 9. The air in Longbourn's drawing room was charged with a different sort of tension than their previous meetings. Darcy, having braved another perilous visit to Hertfordshire, found himself sipping tea opposite Elizabeth, whose gaze, though polite, held a familiar spark of challenge. Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth began, setting down her cup with a delicate clink, I am glad you have come, for I confess myself in need of enlightenment. She rose and retrieved a document from the mantelpiece, a substantial piece of parchment, folded neatly. This arrived a few days ago, and while its contents are most welcome, its provenance perplexes me. She handed it to him. Darcy took it, his brow furrowing slightly at the feel of the heavy paper and the official wax seal. He unfolded it carefully. It was indeed a certificate, boldly declaring the cancellation of a significant, long-standing debt, the unpaid leasing, for decades. Darcy recognized the formal script, the legal jargon. It was utterly legitimate. His eyes, however, stopped at the signature, a flourish of ink, strong and decisive, reading G.D. Elizabeth, watching him keenly, said, You see the signature, Mr. Darcy. G.D. Now, as I understand it, you are the representative for the owner of these local estates, including our estate. Surely, as his agent, you must know who a G.D. is. Her tone was innocently expectant, yet he detected a hint of a trap. Darcy felt a flush creep up his neck. He had indeed been acting on behalf of his father, meticulously implementing reforms and attempting to rectify long-standing issues on the family's more distant, leased properties. He had expected to reveal his involvement eventually when the time was right and he had something tangible to present. But this premature disclosure, prompted by his father's direct, unannounced generosity, was unexpected. He met her gaze, a faint smile playing on his lips. Indeed, Miss Bennet, I do know who G.D. is. That would be my father, George Darcy. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly, a genuine surprise replacing her former challenge. Your father? Mr. Darcy, forgive my presumption, but I was not aware of your family's connection to these particular holdings. It is a rather substantial act of benevolence. Darcy cleared his throat. My father, I confess, has a keen interest in the well-being of his tenants. And, he continued, taking a deeper breath, he is, in fact, in the process of transferring the ownership of these estates, including yours in question, to me. He believes it is time I took on the full responsibility. A moment of silence hung between them, the weight of his revelations settling. Elizabeth blinked. Then a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. To you, Mr. Darcy, that is wonderful. Her delight seemed utterly genuine, shining in her eyes. To think the new owner will be someone who already demonstrates such a generous spirit, and who, I trust, holds the welfare of the people in high regard. But then, a flicker of that practical intelligence returned. Her brow furrowed slightly, though the smile did not entirely fade. However, she added, her voice dropping to a more thoughtful register, you must forgive my candor, Mr. Darcy, but I suspect that while I may believe such a thing, other leased estates themselves might not. They have known years of absentee ownership. A mere certificate, even a most welcome one, might not be enough to convince them. Darcy looked at Elizabeth, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the tea. Her insight was, as always, piercing and true. He had been so focused on the legal transfer, on the meticulous accounting he and his father had undertaken. But Elizabeth, with her feet firmly on the ground, had seen the human element, the ingrained skepticism, the necessity of trust. You are quite right, Miss Bennet, he admitted, folding the certificate precisely. You are quite right. It will require more than a signature to earn their belief. It will require deeds and presence and time. He looked at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. And perhaps some counsel from those who truly understand how to win the hearts of the people. Elizabeth's smile returned, full and bright. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, she said, her eyes sparkling. Indeed it will. The challenge in her gaze had returned, but it was not adversarial. It was an invitation. And Darcy, for the first time, felt truly ready to accept. Chapter 10. The drawing room at Longbourn was quiet, bathed in the cool light of a late autumn afternoon. Elizabeth sat opposite Darcy, clutching a faded ledger of estate accounts that she had been studying in preparation for their marriage. Her usual vivacity was clouded by irritation, her eyes sharp with disappointment. It was pointless, Mr. Darcy, she declared, tossing the book onto the mahogany table. I spent all morning traveling to all largest leaseholder families. I spoke plainly. I suggested that if they would just make a simple application, their debt would be canceled entirely. Darcy watched her, his expression reserved but attentive. And their response? They treated me as if I were a missionary offering them snake oil, Elizabeth exclaimed, rising to pace the length of the carpet. Mrs. Rickerston accused me of being a spy sent to map their furniture before the seizure. Mr. Gibbs swore that the only reason they had been offered a full debt cancellation was if the new terms were impossibly onerous, a trap to make them landless within the year. She stopped before him, hands on her hips. They rejected good faith, Mr. Darcy. They rejected the possibility of rescue. They would rather cling to their misery and fear than admit that the future owner of the land might possess a single ounce of genuine generosity. The frustration spilled over into a direct challenge, her voice softening slightly with genuine pain. If you intend to cancel their debts eventually, if that is your long-term goal for the stability of the holdings, why inflict this agonizing waiting period? Why not simply announce the cancellation now and end their suffering? Darcy leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked not merely at Elizabeth, but through her, focused on the deep responsibilities that weighed upon his lineage. Elizabeth, he said, his voice low and serious, and yes, it has always been my intention to clear the ledgers for those who prove themselves worthy of the land. But I must be brutally clear. I am not merely the landlord of Pemberley. I am the steward of a great many livelihoods, and I cannot afford tenants who believe that integrity means weakness. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The previous management, regrettably, allowed the leasing structure to become lax. Debt accumulated not always through misfortune, but often through rank carelessness, extravagance, and a conviction that the owner, being perpetually wealthy, would never enforce the terms. And you are correcting that, Elizabeth conceded. I am correcting it by applying pressure, Darcy stated. The debt, its very existence, and the fear of its enforcement is acting as a filter. It is an unpleasant crucible, but a necessary one. Elizabeth frowned. A filter for what? For character, Elizabeth. When I assume control, I require leaseholders who are not merely solvent, but who possess the moral foundation to respect the agreement and the humility to survive genuine hardship. He began to tick off the necessary qualities, his gaze fixed and unwavering. I need families who are honorable, who prioritize the health of the land over short-term gain, and who pay their dues because it is right, not because they fear the bailiff. I need families who are not greedy, who, when pressed by debt, do not immediately begin the selfish maneuvering you witnessed this morning, hiding assets, lying about their true situation, or refusing to believe you. Darcy's jaw tightened. And crucially, Elizabeth, I need families who are not too proud to confess their failures. Those who come to me admit that they overspent, or that their crops failed due to poor planning, or that they just have been too flaccid and seek a path to recovery. Those are the men I will raise up. The man who maintains a facade of prosperity even as his children starve, the man who blames everyone but himself, is a threat to the community. He drew a breath, turning back to the final, most damning point. And last, I need tenants who are not closing their ears against truth. The families you met today knew I was offering a reprieve. They were so convinced of their own prejudice that they physically rejected the truth you offered them. They preferred their prejudgment to their own salvation. Elizabeth stood silently, absorbing the weight of his argument. It was pragmatic, harsh, and devastatingly true. The men who feared Darcy's generosity more than his cruelty were not fit to manage the land. This current situation, Darcy concluded, leaning back slightly, forces them to drop their masks. Those who are worthy, the few who will approach us with honesty, humility, and a willingness to work for their absolution, will find that their debt is wiped clean, and they will be offered renewed leases on generous terms, guaranteed for their lifetimes. He met her gaze, his expression earnest. But those who remain obstinate, who are too proud to confess their failures, and too prejudiced to accept a genuine hand-up, they will prove themselves unfit for the responsibility I intend to bestow. Their folly will decide their future far more effectively than any eviction notice I could write. You are using debt as a moral sieve, Elizabeth whispered, understanding finally the difficult cold logic behind his strategy. If the land is to flourish, it must be worked by responsible hands, Elizabeth. I will cancel the debts, yes. But first, I must find out who deserves to stay and who, by their own character, must leave. Chapter 11. The chill of a late autumn morning had settled over Hertfordshire, but Elizabeth Bennet arrived at Lucas Lodge with a warmth that had nothing to do with the brisk pace of her walk. She found Charlotte Lucas in the small, comfortable parlor, engaged in the domestic duty of mending muslin, her expression one of quiet, habitual resignation. "Elizabeth, you are quite flushed," Charlotte observed, setting aside her needlework. "Has the morning air proven too spirited, or have you perhaps encountered an unexpected spectacle in the lane?" Elizabeth sank into a chair, her bonnet strings loosened, her agitation spilling out before she could properly frame the words. "Charlotte, I have news so extraordinary, so utterly relieving, that I scarcely know how to relate it without sounding utterly foolish." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It concerns the leasing debts, the perpetual uncertainty that weighs upon our fathers and so many others around Meryton. You know how the burden of the long leases, passed down through generations, seems impossible to ever truly clear." Charlotte nodded, her eyes growing keen. Lucas Lodge, though better situated than Longbourn, was still subject to significant financial obligations to the estate owners. the distant landlords whose rents and leases define their very existence. Of course, it is the vexation of our lives. What of it, Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth began, her voice softening slightly at the name. Mr. Darcy informed me that there is a possibility, a very real possibility, that the owner, his father, is preparing to cancel the bulk of these old leasing debts. Charlotte's calm dissolved instantly. Cancel them? Elizabeth, that is unheard of. Landlords do not simply relinquish such substantial income. It would require an act of Parliament or a bankruptcy of the estate itself. It is neither, Elizabeth insisted, leaning forward. It is apparently a matter of consolidating obligations and introducing better management. But that is not all. He also told me that within the space of a year, his father intends to transfer the entire ownership of these specific leased estates around Meryton. She gestured vaguely toward the surrounding lands, directly to him. Charlotte stared, grasping the profound implications. If Mr. Darcy were to become their sole immediate landlord, the entire dynamic of Meryton's economic structure would change overnight. So Mr. Darcy is speaking about his own inheritance, Charlotte mused, ever the pragmatist. That explains his knowledge, but not his father's generosity. Elizabeth, you must be utterly certain of this. Such rumors, should they prove false, would cause dreadful disappointment. I know what it sounds like, Elizabeth admitted, her hand pressing against her chest. It is the kind of news that reason dictates one should doubt immediately. But Charlotte, I feel that in my heart that Darcy spoke the truth. He spoke with such gravity, such firm conviction, and assured me it was not a matter of speculation, but of impending action. She stood, retrieving her reticule, and produced a folded, heavy sheet of paper, Mr. Bennet's official document. And I have more than only my feelings to rely upon, she said, smoothing the paper onto the table. My father, ever cautious, already made the application a week ago. Following Mr. Darcy's advice to act swiftly, he received the answer 2 days ago. Charlotte leaned closer, her brow furrowed as she read the precise official language. It was a formal confirmation of debt cancellation from Mr. Bennet's family. This is extraordinary, Charlotte whispered, tapping the dense script. Your father has the confirmation that the process exists. That changes everything. It is not gossip. It is procedure finally being detailed. The paper was proof that the possibility was real, but it also confirmed the necessity of swift action. Mr. Bennet had acted quickly, driven perhaps by Elizabeth's earlier excitement, but Sir William Lucas was often slow to move on matters demanding detailed bureaucracy. Mr. Darcy spoke about the necessity of an application, Charlotte. A formal petition must be filed immediately to qualify for the cancellation, Elizabeth stressed. If this is to bring the relief it promises, we cannot afford delay. My father has already done the work, but yours, Charlotte sighed, the shadow returning to her eyes. My father is happy to entertain the notion of a debt-free future, but utterly disinclined to undertake the labor required to secure it. The thought of engaging with estate lawyers gives him the headache, and he will put it off until the opportunity is past. She looked again at the confirmation document, then at Elizabeth's earnest, hopeful face. The thought of her family finally being free of the shadow of perpetual dues, of Sir William being able to manage Lucas Lodge without the inherited weight, was too compelling to ignore. Very well, Elizabeth, Charlotte said, folding the document carefully before handing it back. I understand the urgency and the magnitude of this relief. I promise you that I shall try to convince him this very afternoon. I will sit with him, explain the details you received, and ensure he makes the necessary application without fail or delay. Chapter 12. The air in the village square, once thick with the scent of baking bread and blooming honeysuckle, now held a metallic tang of fear and defiance. Elizabeth, her heart a tight knot of apprehension, watched from her window as the crowd gathered. The whispering chorus had grown into a guttural roar, a tide of suspicion lapping at the edges of her small cottage. Her initial efforts to convey Darcy's message had been met with cautious optimism by some. A flicker of hope, ignited by the possibility of escaping the crushing weight of leasing payments, had begun to spread. But hope, it seemed, was a dangerous commodity in these parts. It was as if the very act of suggesting a reprieve had stirred a hornet's nest of resentment and fear. The opposition, once a scattered collection of grumbles, had coalesced into a formidable force. They had rallied around the leader, Mr. Wickham, whose voice boomed with righteous indignation and whose eyes glinted with a chilling resolve. The narrative had shifted, twisting Elizabeth's earnest message into a malicious deception. Darcy, the stranger who had appeared with a proposal of leniency, was now painted as a villain, a crafty schemer aiming to lull them into a false sense of security before seizing their land entirely. Whispers of his illegitimate claim to representing the estate owner, of his supposed manipulation of Elizabeth, filled the air like poisonous pollen. "She's a pawn," Wickham had declared during the last village meeting, his voice echoing through the sparsely furnished hall. "A pretty face used by a wolf in sheep's clothing to steal what is ours." Elizabeth had tried to reason with them, to present the debt cancellation confirmation letters from the solicitor, to explain his genuine desire to alleviate their burdens. But her words, once met with a semblance of respect, now fell on deaf ears, or worse, were twisted and used against her. "They're trying to divide us," was the new mantra. The solidarity they had found in shared hardship was now being weaponized against them. Families who had looked to Elizabeth with dawning hope were now being threatened, ostracized, their loyalty to the group questioned. Children were warned away from Elizabeth's family. Husbands glowered at their wives who dared to speak her name with anything but venom. The communal bond, once a source of comfort, had become a cage. And then came the chilling escalation. The whispers of discontent had hardened into a chilling resolve. Elizabeth saw it in the way the men gathered in knots, their conversations low and urgent. She saw it in the glint of tools, spades, scythes, even the occasional rusty musket being openly displayed, no longer hidden away as mere implements of labor. One evening as she was returning home, a group of men blocked her path. Wickham stood at their head, his face shadowed by the setting sun. He didn't shout or threaten her directly, but his gaze was a palpable weight, heavy with unspoken menace. "We know what you're trying to do, Elizabeth," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "You and that Darcy. You think you can break us, but we won't let you." He gestured to the men behind him, their faces grim and set. "We're prepared. If you try to force this on us, if you try to turn us against each other, we'll defend ourselves, with whatever it takes." The implication hung in the air, a silent promise of violence. The metallic tang in the air was no longer just fear. It was the scent of blood waiting to be spilled. Elizabeth's heart pounded against her ribs, not just for herself, but for the fragile peace she had hoped to foster, now threatened by a storm she had inadvertently helped to unleash. She had brought them good news, but in doing so, she had inadvertently stirred the embers of a conflict that threatened to consume them all. The opposition wasn't just growing, it was hardening, solidifying into a wall of resistance, prepared to spill blood to keep what they perceived as theirs. And Elizabeth, standing on the precipice of this escalating feud, felt a profound sense of dread, wondering if anything could truly salvage the situation now. Chapter 13. The Longbourn drawing room, usually a vibrant hub of domestic activity, felt unusually quiet that evening. A chill autumn wind rattled the panes, a fitting accompaniment to the disquiet that had settled over Hertfordshire and, more acutely, over the two figures seated by the flickering hearth. Elizabeth Bennet, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, gazed into the flames, her expression thoughtful, while Mr. Darcy, across from her, watched her with an intensity that spoke of shared burdens. "It seems to escalate with each passing day," Elizabeth finally murmured, breaking the silence. "The whispers grow louder, the accusations more brazen. It is not merely that they refuse to believe us, Fitzwilliam. It is that they do not wish to believe us. To admit the truth would be to dismantle the comfortable fictions they have built around themselves, or perhaps around others." Darcy nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Indeed, their obstinacy is rooted not in ignorance, but in a strange, willful blindness, or worse, in a vested interest in maintaining the deception. We have presented the facts, laid bare the machinations, yet their disbelief only hardens. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Elizabeth. I have found myself seeking solace in some scriptures of late. The truths within the scriptures often hold a wisdom that transcends their immediate context. She paused, turning to meet his gaze, a faint, almost shy smile touching her lips. I hope you will forgive my bringing it up, but I found a passage that resonated with me profoundly, and I believe it speaks to our current predicament, perhaps even offering a lens through which to view the unreasoning opposition we face. Darcy inclined his head, curiosity tempering his usual reserve. Pray, speak your mind, Elizabeth. Your insights are ever valuable. It is from Matthew, she began, her voice gaining a quiet conviction. Chapter 21, verses 33 to 41. It is the parable of the wicked vine dressers. It describes a homeowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away on a journey. She paused, allowing the imagery to settle before continuing. When harvest time approached, he sent his servants to collect his share of the fruit. But the tenants seized his servants. Some they beat, some they stoned, and one they even killed. He sent more servants, greater in number, and they were treated likewise. Finally, he sent his son, thinking, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on Darcy's, searching for understanding. The passage, in its original context, describes God's relationship with his people and their turning away from him. But as I read it, I could not help but see parallels to our own situation. Your father, in his trust and generosity, had leased his estates to people that he believed would act with honor and manage them justly. Instead, they have misused that possibility, twisting the opportunity for their own gain. Her voice hardened slightly, reflecting the indignation she felt. They have not merely mismanaged or taken advantage. They have actively turned themselves against the rightful owner. They have scorned the trust placed in them, enriched themselves unjustly, and when their deceit was brought to light, they responded with hostility, with slander, and with a deliberate campaign to discredit and undermine the true heir. They seek to deny your legitimacy, Fitzwilliam, not out of honest error, but from a calculated desire to seize what is not theirs. Darcy listened, his expression evolving from attentive curiosity to a profound recognition. The allegorical narrative resonated deeply with the very real betrayal he had experienced. He saw in vivid clarity the men who had been entrusted with the management of the estates, the very individuals who had spread malicious gossip when confronted, stirring up the very opposition Elizabeth had spoken of. They had been given a vineyard, a legacy to tend, and they had sought to usurp it, to claim the harvest as their own by forcing deception. The wicked vine dressers, Darcy murmured thoughtfully, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. They believed that if they removed the heir, the inheritance would become theirs by default. It is a chillingly accurate description of the mindset we face. They are not merely resisting the truth. They are fighting for a false inheritance, convinced that by destroying our standing, they can claim what belongs to my father. A quiet strength settled between them, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their struggle. Elizabeth's insight had not offered a solution, but it had provided a powerful framework for comprehension, validating their sense of injustice and clarifying the insidious nature of their adversaries. It makes their actions less baffling, does it not? Elizabeth said, a flicker of renewed resolve in her eyes. It is not ignorance, but avarice, not misunderstanding, but malice. And knowing that, perhaps, makes the fight, however wearing, a little clearer. We are not merely disputing facts, we are challenging those who seek to steal a legacy. Darcy reached across the space separating them, his hand briefly covering hers. The gesture was fleeting, but spoke volumes of his gratitude and their unspoken bond. Thank you, Elizabeth, he said, his voice low and firm. You always find a way to illuminate the path, even in the deepest shadows. The quiet understanding of the parable had, in a strange way, strengthened their resolve, confirming that the fight they were waging was not merely for reputation, but for truth, justice, and the rightful inheritance of a name. Chapter 14. The Longbourn drawing room, usually a place of pleasant, trivial distraction, had become the unlikely headquarters for a quiet revolution. The crisis surrounding Darcy's late father's estates, the refusal of the powerful leaseholders to acknowledge Darcy's legal authority, fueled by lies, greed, and pride, had forced an unusual intimacy and focus upon them. Elizabeth leaned back, a triumphant yet gentle smile playing on her lips. "I have found a further passage, Mr. Darcy, which describes our current predicament with such uncanny accuracy that I confess I laughed when I first read it," she began, tapping a slender finger on the open Bible laid between them. Darcy looked up, his expression a familiar blend of worry and resolute control. "I assure you, Miss Bennet, I have found little cause for merriment in the description of a state seizure." "Ah, but this describes not the seizure, but the denial," Elizabeth corrected, her eyes sparkling with intellectual mirth. She cleared her throat and read, her voice steady and clear. "He came unto his own, and his own received him not." Darcy felt a cold, sharp recognition. The families who had leased his father's most productive lands, families who owed their long stability to the Darcy name, had not merely disputed his claims. They had actively repudiated him, forming a hostile coalition designed to render him impotent. "The parallels are striking, I grant you," Darcy murmured, nodding slowly. "Wait, for it improves," Elizabeth continued, her smile widening as she moved to the subsequent verse. "But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe unto his name." She paused, allowing the implication of the allegory to sink in. She and the few remaining loyal tenants, those who had risked their own fortunes and safety by affirming Darcy's right, were the receivers and believers in the metaphor. "And your special right, Mr. Darcy," she explained, leaning forward conspiratorially, "was the immediate and complete cancellation of their outstanding leasing debts. You have given them the power to begin anew, absolved of their past burdens, simply for trusting in your name." A profound gravity settled upon Darcy's features. Her ability to cut through his agonizing legal complexities with such simple, elegant truth never ceased to astound him. "You have found poetry, Miss Bennet, where I had only found litigation," he admitted. Elizabeth adopted a thoughtful air, tilting her head. "Indeed, which brings me to the core of my inquiry, sir. We have established that I, too, have received you and believed in your name, often in the face of my own family's mild confusion." She tapped the final phrase of the scripture. "The cancellation of debt, while a pleasing reward for those struggling tenants, is applicable to my family, but not to me personally. But the verse offers a greater prize, power to become the children of God, and I must confess a certain disappointment." Darcy raised an anxious brow. "Disappointment?" "Yes," she said, her eyes brimming with humor. "Unless you intend to declare me your father's long-lost natural daughter, this magnificent right described in the passage does seem to exclude me. If I cannot become your father's daughter, a biological impossibility, I assure you, what other rights, Mr. Darcy, might I expect for my loyalty and belief?" She fixed him with a challenging gaze, daring him to respond with the detached practicality he usually employed when discussing business. Darcy suddenly found the papers on the table intolerable. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, closed the heavy book. His breathing was shallow, and his cheeks, usually so pale and composed, flushed a deep red that spread up to his temples. He was momentarily speechless, captured by the dazzling wit and the inherent vulnerability in her jest. This woman used scripture to mock the limits of his authority, yet simultaneously affirmed her complete trust in him. He realized that the right she sought was not legal, but personal, a claim far more precious than any estate or a canceled debt. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and strained. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice low, filled with a hesitant sincerity that surprised them both. "I must confess that specific description, your desire to become, if not my father's daughter, then perhaps intimately connected to my family, is in fact not far from my own desires." He gripped the edge of the table, steeling himself. The situation was disastrous. He was fighting for his family's honor and fortune against powerful enemies. Yet he could not let this moment of perfect, shared understanding pass. "You ask what further rights I might offer you in return for your unparalleled acceptance," he continued, meeting her eyes, allowing his deepest passion to override his customary reserve. "The greatest right I possess, Elizabeth, is the claim to my own name and home." He swallowed hard, the magnitude of the question hanging in the quiet room. If it is not too early, if it is not an insult to ask you to share in a future that is currently embroiled in such hostility and uncertainty, Elizabeth, would you be willing to become my wife?" He saw the swift, beautiful shock register on her face, quickly followed by a deepening tenderness. "I know," he rushed on before she could reply, his logic taking over, "that such a union, while devoutly wished for by me, is currently impractical. We cannot celebrate a marriage while these rebellious factions seek to destroy the very foundations of the estates. But should you accept, it would give me the strength, the certainty, to face this dreadful conflict. We would wait, but knowing I had your hand pledged, knowing that you truly would become part of my family, would give purpose to the solving of this crisis." Elizabeth did not laugh now. The mirth had vanished, replaced by a profound seriousness that matched his own. Her eyes, usually so sharp with observation, were soft with feeling. "Mr. Darcy," she whispered, reaching out to rest her hand gently over his. "I have already received you, believed in you, and found myself aligned against those who denied you. You need not wait for a settled future to gain my alliance." The simple act of her touch canceled the weight of his fear. Hope, vibrant and consuming, flooded through him. "I have no interest in merely becoming your father's daughter, sir," Elizabeth finished, a slow, radiant smile returning to her lips, though now rooted in deep affection. "But I would be very happy indeed to become your wife, and I look forward to the day when we can return to our home, not to solve further legal riddles, but to begin our new life together." Darcy let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the crisis began. The hostile world outside Longbourn still raged, but here by the window, in the simple, profound agreement of their hearts, the battle had already been won. Chapter 15. The Longbourn study was rarely a place of political plotting, usually serving only as a sanctuary for comfortable reading and Mr. Bennet's dry wit. But this evening, the heavy oak desk was cleared of volumes, and the air was thick with seriousness, illuminated only by the flicker of a reluctant fire. Mr. Bennet sat opposite Mr. Darcy, who leaned forward, his usual composure slightly strained. Elizabeth stood near the window, her hand resting on the cool pane, listening intently. "The situation, Darcy, is deteriorating not because of your presence, but because of its duration," Mr. Bennet stated, tapping a quill on the desk. "For the last week since the notice of your claim was posted, we saw exactly what you needed to see. Who among the tenants and the smaller gentry are prepared to honor the rightful ownership, and who are determined to defy it under the influence of those certain disaffected parties?" Darcy nodded, recognizing the truth of the assessment. His arrival in Hertfordshire had been necessary to assert his claim to the disputed estates that bordered his core holdings. A situation fraught with local resentment and legal ambiguity waiting for the strongest hand to seize control. "The bailiffs and servants of those who oppose me have become increasingly bold," Darcy admitted. "I have encountered ill will, but no direct violence yet." "Precisely," Mr. Bennet cut in, leaning back. "You have achieved your initial objective. The lines are drawn, but every day you remain here, physically present at Longbourn, daring the opposition to act, you turn a legal and proprietary disagreement into a potential skirmish. And you place us, the Bennet family, and worse, those loyal families who have already sworn their fealty to you, in immediate danger." Elizabeth turned from the window, her gaze settling on Darcy. She knew her father was right. Longbourn was not a fortress, and her family's safety could not be risked on a protracted standoff. "What do you suggest, sir?" Darcy asked, conceding the point with reluctance. "I suggest, my dear boy, that having shown your face, you now remove it. Return to London, attend to the matters of law there, and allow the local opposition to believe that their defiance has momentarily succeeded in driving you off," Mr. Bennet said, a flicker of shrewd strategy in his eye. "The fire will cool. They will argue amongst themselves about the next step, and perhaps the necessity of returning rents to the legitimate owner will slowly prevail over their pride." Darcy considered this carefully. It was a retreat, yes, but a strategic one. He would be moving from the vulnerable vanguard to the well-defended headquarters. "And Elizabeth?" he asked softly, looking directly at her. Elizabeth walked to his side, placing a hand lightly upon his shoulder. "I will not follow you into danger, Fitzwilliam, but neither will I allow you to remain in it for my sake. My father is correct. Your immediate departure is the wisest course." A sharp pain of disappointment crossed Darcy's features. He had planned to make arrangements for their wedding here quickly, so that she might be removed from the troubled county as his wife. "Then the plan must be adjusted," Darcy stated, regaining his authoritative air. "I will leave for London before dawn. I will put all matters pertaining to the legal transfer into motion, secure court backing for my claims, and prepare our home there." He paused, looking at Elizabeth with deep meaning. "I will return when this immediate danger has subsided and the roads are truly safe, to take you to London. We shall be married there quickly and without ostentation, and only after we are secure as husband and wife will I return here to put the situation with the estates fully in order." Mr. Bennet nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Propriety, law, and strategy all served." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "It is a relief to know our marriage will be an event of happiness and safety, rather than a hurried flight from threats." Darcy stood, grasping both her hands firmly. "However, Longbourn will not be left undefended, nor will the families who stood with us be abandoned. I will ride out, but I shall dispatch immediate orders tonight. By midday tomorrow, my most trusted men will be here." He turned to Mr. Bennet. "I will send several of my grooms and footmen, men sworn to my service and accustomed to guarding properties. They will possess no official authority, merely the strength and loyalty needed to protect your household, sir, and to discreetly monitor the immediate lanes. Furthermore, I will send messages to those who acknowledge my rights, offering the same protection, should they accept it." Mr. Bennet was visibly moved by this comprehensive commitment. "That is more than generous, Darcy. It is necessary. It provides me with peace of mind that no amount of reading could afford." Darcy moved towards the door, already planning logistics in his head. The farewell he shared with Elizabeth was brief and intense, a shared understanding of the gravity of their enforced separation and the promise of their future reunion. "Take care, Elizabeth," he whispered, holding her chin between his fingers. "Do not ride out alone. Trust the men I send. They trust me implicitly, and their orders will be simple. Guard the Bennet family with their lives." "I will be safe, Fitzwilliam. You must be safe also," she replied, her eyes filled with a resolute love that bolstered his purpose. Within the hour, the quiet estate was stirred by hushed activity. Darcy's valet was packing, riders were being dispatched under the cover of darkness with sealed instructions, and the air of tense political conflict had been replaced by the quiet, efficient preparation for a defense. Darcy would leave the danger, but he would leave his shield behind. As he looked back at the light still burning in Mr. Bennet's study, the last light he would see on Longbourn for weeks, he knew the temporary distance was a painful price, but one necessary to ensure that when he next returned, it would be to claim not just the estates, but his beloved wife permanently. Chapter 16. After the departure of Mr. Darcy to London, the Bennets' drawing room, once reserved for the trivial calls of neighborhood gossip, became the clandestine hub of handling the insolvency of Meryton estates. Families who had loudly declared Darcy's tenancy demands a tyranny, the Gilberts, the Harrisons, even old Mr. Thorpe, came cloaked in dusk or under the pretense of borrowing a recipe, their faces pale with forced humility. They did not come to petition Elizabeth, but to seek the practical counsel of Mr. Bennet regarding the application forms for the cancellation of their accumulated estate leasing debts, a concession Darcy had offered to those willing to acknowledge his legal ownership. "They look like gallows birds approaching the confessor, Lizzie," Mr. Bennet remarked one evening, watching a carriage depart under the cover of thick fog. Their pride is a heavy coat, but the prospect of utter financial ruin is a sharper north wind. These subtle surrenders gutted the core resistance. The opposition, once a sprawling network of indignant gentlemen, shrank into a hard, bitter nucleus. They were men whose debts were too great, or whose pride was too vast, to accept the charity of the man they deemed an interloper. They felt betrayed by their neighbors and saw Elizabeth, who remained defiantly secure in the eye of the storm, as the physical embodiment of Darcy's influence. The remaining faction did not dissipate. It solidified into something venomous. If they could not defeat Darcy in court or through community rejection, they would attack the symbol closest to him. The first incident was so subtle, Elizabeth almost dismissed it. She had been tasked with delivering a small basket of preserves to Mrs. Phillips in the village, enjoying the crisp autumn air along the narrow, seldom-used path that cut through Farmer Giles's pasture. She heard the sound of rushing water long before she reached the old stone clapper bridge. As she stepped onto the bridge, her foot slipped. The central worn flagstone spun slightly beneath her weight. She corrected herself, heart hammering, glancing down to see the stone had been crudely wedged, its supports dislodged just enough to create a treacherous pivot point. A serious fall there would have meant a sure break or a concussion in the cold stream below. Just as she regained her balance, a man emerged from the thicket nearby, ostensibly checking a fence line. He was too large, too silent, and his gait was too stiff for a simple farmhand. He watched her until she was safe on the opposite bank, then turned away without a word. Elizabeth walked home disturbed, unable to shake the image of the man's shadowed face. The very next morning, however, Mr. Bennet was approached by a stout, unassuming man named Stokes, who quietly inquired about the loose stone. "Mr. Darcy left instructions, sir," Stokes murmured, adjusting his broad, plain coat, "to ensure all pathways used by the family are sound. We are repairing it now." Elizabeth realized with a chilling certainty that the farmhand had not been watching her progress, but waiting for her failure. And Stokes was not a local handyman. He was one of the many loyal, highly trained men Darcy had left behind, a silent perimeter around Longbourn. The opposition grew bolder as the days shortened. Their plan escalated from sabotage to direct intimidation. The major attempt occurred 3 weeks later, during a tempestuous evening. Elizabeth had ventured out, umbrella in hand, to deliver a manuscript to the local vicarage, a journey of half a mile through the thick, wind-whipped hedgerows. She deliberately chose the main road, thinking safety lay in visibility. She was wrong. As she passed a particularly dark stretch where the road dipped sharply, a carriage, unlit and traveling too fast, pulled abreast of her. Before she could react, 2 bulky figures dropped from the carriage's far side, their faces obscured by the shadows and the hoods of their coarse coats. "Miss Bennet," one hissed, his voice heavy with malice and the foul odor of strong drink. "Tonight you shall tell your grand protector that Meryton does not bow to his charity." A strong hand clamped down hard on her wrist, twisting it painfully until her umbrella clattered away across the stones. The second man moved to block her retreat toward the vicarage. They did not intend to rob her. The aggression in their grip was purely punitive. They meant to hurt her, perhaps to mark her, sending a brutal message back to Darcy in London. Elizabeth struggled, her heart leaping into her throat, but they were immensely strong, pulling her toward the deep, muddy ditch. She cried out, the sound swallowed instantly by the relentless wind. Just as the men prepared to force her down, a soundless flurry erupted from the hedgerows behind her. It was not shouting, but the sickening thud of precise impact. 2 more figures, moving with bewildering speed and coordination, sprang out of the darkness. They were silent, efficient shadows. They did not carry conventional weaponry, but relied on absolute surprise and trained force. The man gripping Elizabeth's arm grunted sharply as a knee found his kidney, and his grip instantly slackened. Before he could recover, his assailant had twisted his arm high behind his back, forcing him to his knees in the mud. The second aggressor, attempting to reach for a concealed weapon, found his jaw meeting an elbow, and he collapsed stunned onto the verge. The rescue was over in less than 10 seconds. Elizabeth, released but trembling violently, stumbled backwards, leaning against the cold stone roadside. She watched, breath held tight, as her rescuers did not pause to gloat or announce their triumph. Instead, they efficiently administered a few more calculated bruises to ensure their captives were incapacitated and intimidated. Then, as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared, they vanished again into the churning blackness of the hedgerows, leaving behind only the sound of heavy breathing, the wind, and the groans of the defeated assailants wallowing in the ditch. Elizabeth walked the remaining distance to the vicarage on shaking legs, denying the vicar's wife the true state of her fright. When she returned to Longbourn, she found Mr. Darcy's chief footman, a man named George, tending to the fire in the drawing room, though it was not his regular duty. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. Miss Elizabeth, he said softly, moving to pour her sherry. The wind is vile tonight. Did you find your journey difficult? Elizabeth held the warm glass, her fingers still tingling from the residual shock. She swallowed hard, searching his face. She knew then that she was living under a constant, silent siege, and that Darcy's protection was absolute, extending far beyond the comfort of a letter or an account balance. He had appointed guardians to her, men who walked the periphery of her life, ready to become phantoms of violence the instant she was threatened. It was dark, George, she replied slowly, looking into the fire, and a little wild. But I made it home safely. It seems some people are simply not meant to interfere with the affairs of Longbourn. George allowed the faintest flicker of comprehension in his eyes. He nodded, accepting the coded message and filing it away. Darcy might be away, but his will was enforced here in Meryton with silent, uncompromising authority. Elizabeth realized that while the battle for the estates was being won through ledgers and legal compliance, the battle for her safety was being waged nightly in the shadows, secured by the loyalty and sharp vigilance of Darcy's attentive servants. And the knowledge of that deep, pervasive commitment both humbled and unsettled her fierce independence. Chapter 17. The ink on Darcy's hasty farewell note still held a faint, almost nostalgic scent, a promise whispered against the crisp autumn air. I shall return before next autumn. For Elizabeth, those words had been a beacon, a comforting certainty in the face of his departure. But as the leaves bled from vibrant hues to muted earth tones, and the first biting winds of winter swept across the fields of Longbourn, the waiting began to feel like a heavy cloak. Winter, as it always did, stretched its icy fingers across the land. Days blurred into weeks, each one a mirror of the last, filled with the comforting routines of family life, yet underscored by a persistent gnawing absence. Elizabeth, usually so invigorated by the stark beauty of the season, found herself restless, her gaze often drifting to the distant road, as if expecting to see a familiar carriage emerge from the mist. She'd read and reread Darcy's letters, searching for nuances, for hints of his thoughts, for any scrap of reassurance that would fuel her dwindling hope. Then imperceptibly at first the world began to thaw. The hesitant green shoots of spring pushed through the sodden earth, and the bird song, muted for months, swelled into a joyful chorus. Elizabeth welcomed the renewal of nature with a grateful heart. The sluggishness of winter receded, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. Spring was a gentle prelude, a softening before the crescendo she knew was coming. And then spring surrendered its reign to the languid embrace of summer. The days grew long and warm, filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the buzz of industrious bees. For Elizabeth, the waiting transformed from a dull ache to a vibrant, almost unbearable thrum. Darcy was coming. He had promised to take her to London, to formalize their union, to make their love a matter of public record. Each morning as the first golden rays of sunlight painted the windows of Longbourn, Elizabeth's heart would leap with an almost giddy hope. She'd wake before the household, her mind already a whirlwind of imagined conversations, of shared laughter, of the tender touch of Darcy's hand. She'd dress with a renewed sense of purpose, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, straining to catch sight of the dust plume that would announce his arrival. But as the sun climbed higher and the hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, the familiar disappointment would settle in. The carriage, when it finally appeared, was always carrying familiar faces from Meryton, or perhaps a messenger with news from Hertfordshire. Never Darcy's. The days bled into one another, a relentless cycle of waking with hope and sleeping with the quiet ache of unmet expectation. The vibrant green of summer, once a symbol of burgeoning love, now seemed almost mocking in its relentless cheerfulness. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of the season's end. The goldenrod began to fade, and the evenings carried a subtle chill, a whisper of the coming autumn. And on the very last day of summer, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, melancholic shadows across the lawn, Elizabeth found herself lying in her bed, the silence of her room amplifying the questions swirling in her mind. Had his plans changed? Had some unforeseen circumstance kept him away? Or worse, had his resolve wavered? The promise, once a steadfast anchor, now felt fragile, as tenuous as a spider's silk thread. As sleep finally claimed her, it was not with the gentle peace of fulfilled anticipation, but with a gnawing uncertainty, a whisper of doubt that lingered in the darkness. Would Darcy come at all? Chapter 18. The house of Longbourn was sunk in the absolute stillness of 2 o'clock in the morning, a silence so profound it seemed woven into the heavy fabric of the darkness. Elizabeth Bennet lay in the depths of a dreamless sleep when suddenly a firm, impatient hand shook her shoulder. "Elizabeth, wake up, child, quickly now," whispered her father's voice, rough with urgency. "Darcy is waiting for you." Elizabeth blinked, disoriented by the abrupt command. The candle Mr. Bennet held cast erratic, dancing shadows across the ceiling. "Darcy," she repeated, her voice thick with sleep. "At the gate. He has arranged everything. You are to leave for London immediately. Tonight, my dear, the waiting is over." The words struck her like a sudden, glorious sunrise. The waiting is over. That agonizing, protracted period of preparation had felt like an eternity since the promise had been made. A wave of profound, soul-deep relief washed over her, chasing away the remnants of sleep and replacing them with a focused, thrilling energy. She sprang from the bed, requiring no encouragement. This was not merely the end of a courtship. It was the blessed cessation of uncertainty. "I only need a moment, Papa," she vowed, already snatching up her garments. She dressed with a speed born of necessity and excitement, pulling on the warmest traveling gown she possessed, fastening her cloak with trembling fingers, and pausing only long enough to braid her hair into a neat coil beneath her bonnet. She snatched up a small reticule containing only the necessities Darcy had instructed her to keep ready. The descent down the cold, echoing staircase felt like a flight. The hall was chilly, smelling faintly of old wood and morning dew. And then she saw him. He stood just inside the main door, tall and imposing, yet looking utterly sleepless and anxious until his eyes found hers. His face, usually characterized by a reserved dignity, broke into a look of overwhelming tenderness. Elizabeth ran the last few steps. He met her halfway, sweeping her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke volumes of his own impatience. The hard, familiar line of his body beneath her chilled fingers was instantly comforting. It was the solidity of a promise kept, the profound warmth of security. Her father's warnings, the criticisms of the neighborhood, the very geography that separated them, all dissolved in that instant. It was comforting. It was heavenly. "My darling Elizabeth," he murmured against her hair, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Mr. Bennet closed the door softly behind them, granting them their privacy as Darcy led her quickly out to the waiting carriage. The journey to London was swift and enveloped in the intimate cocoon of the closed post-chaise. The world outside was a shifting canvas of black fields and speeding shadows, illuminated only by the lamps of the carriage and the occasional burst of starlight. Inside, however, there was perfect understanding. Darcy had wrapped a heavy rug around her knees and insisted she lean against him. Their conversation was low, punctuated by long, contented silences, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves. He spoke of his impatience, of the sudden clearance of the final legal hurdles that allowed him to retrieve her immediately, and of the plans waiting for them in London. She spoke less, content simply to exist in the sphere of his protective presence. She watched the seriousness slowly leave his features, replaced by a deep, anticipatory joy that made him look younger and freer than she had ever seen him. Every touch of his hand, every shared smile in the dim light, was a reaffirmation of the blissful reality that they were finally, irrevocably, together. They arrived in London as dawn was breaking, ushered into one of Darcy's grand townhouses, where a small, impeccably drilled staff met them. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation, fittings, and introductions. The wedding was magnificent. It took place in a vast, historically significant church renowned for its architecture, attended by a glittering assembly of London society and every member of Darcy's own formidable family circle. Elizabeth had never seen such splendor. The church was adorned with lavish floral arrangements that scented the stale air with hothouse roses and lilies. The music filled the vaulted ceilings with glorious, uplifting sound, but nothing prepared her for the dress. She had imagined a lovely gown, suitable to society, perhaps of white silk. What she saw, commissioned secretly by Darcy's aunt, the respectable but warm Lady Matlock, was a creation of ethereal beauty. It was fashioned from white satin so heavy it seemed liquid, overlaid with yards of antique Brussels lace. Lace so delicate it appeared to be spun from frozen dew, shimmering with infinitesimal seed pearls embroidered across the bodice and sleeves. It was a dress she had not imagined to exist at all, a symbol not just of wealth, but of profound respect and honor. As she walked down the aisle, her heart swelled not just with love for Darcy, but with genuine emotion at the sight of the rows of distinguished faces who smiled warmly in return. Darcy's relatives, the Matlocks and the various cousins, welcomed her to their family from their heart. There was no coldness, no judgment, only relieved satisfaction that Fitzwilliam had chosen so wisely and so purely. Even the formidable Aunt Matlock embraced her with tearful warmth, pronouncing her a truly spirited catch. The exchange of vows, the gravity of the commitments they made, was the still point in the swirling chaos of magnificence. When Darcy placed the ring on her finger, their eyes met, and the public splendor faded entirely, leaving behind only the profound intimacy of their union. The subsequent reception was a feast, a symphony of fine food, champagne, and celebratory conversation. Elizabeth, now Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy, moved through the gilded rooms on her husband's arm, accepting compliments and congratulations with a grace she had found she possessed. But the day was long, and after the final toast was offered to their future happiness, Darcy gently guided her toward a secluded side door. "Enough of spectacle, my love," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It is time to retreat." They left the glittering throng behind, the sounds of laughter and music fading as they were driven to Darcy's primary London residence, a massive, stately manor in Grosvenor Square, far larger and more formal than the house they had first arrived at. It was here in the quiet, lavish embrace of their own home that the honeymoon commenced. It was the blessed final fulfillment of the hurried, heavenly embrace she had received in the cold hall of Longbourn, now exchanged for the sacred warmth of their shared life. The waiting was truly, wonderfully over. Chapter 19. The air in the back parlor of the Crown and Anchor was thick with the residue of cheap brandy, cigar smoke, and sheer burning resentment. George Wickham, immaculately dressed but radiating an almost visible aura of panic, slammed his fist onto the narrow mahogany table, rattling the glasses held by the 6 nervous men assembled before him. "The audacity!" he hissed, his usual charming veneer replaced by a mask of cold fury. "The sheer, unforgivable betrayal. She is Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy. We have been made fools of, gentlemen." Mr. King, leaning against the damp wall, wrung his hands so violently his knuckles cracked. "But, sir," King stammered, his voice a terrified squeak, "how did she escape the bounds of Longbourn?" "In the dark night, apparently, like a common servant fleeing a creditor," Wickham spat, It matters not how, but that she did. She and Darcy are married, legally bound, no doubt laughing at the shambles of our organization. The opposition had banked everything on preventing this union. The goal was to crush Darcy's influence in the area, thus settling Wickham's long-standing personal scores. Now they faced not just failure, but ruin. Darcy was not a man known for mercy. "Silence," Wickham commanded, sensing the imminent collapse of morale. "We may have lost this battle, but we shall not lose the war for the estates. We must immediately construct an alternative narrative. A believable narrative." He leaned in, his eyes glittering with malicious calculation. No one must acknowledge the marriage. Miss Elizabeth Bennet did not elope. She did not marry Mr. Darcy. She fled Longbourn in a state of profound mental collapse, suffering from a violent fit of melancholia. A low murmur swept the room. "Madness?" whispered a man named Denny. "The very word, Denny. A terrible strain of hereditary madness, perhaps aggravated by the unsuitability of her prospects," Wickham continued, weaving the lie with practiced ease. "Mrs. Bennet, for the protection of the family honor, was forced to commit her to a private institution far away, where they are highly experienced with the most delicate constitution." Wickham let the implication sink in. Bedlam. The word struck fear into polite society. It explained her absence permanently, while simultaneously damaging her reputation and any theoretical claims she might make later. "She is locked away," Wickham concluded firmly. "Therefore, the estates remain in their current, soundly leased hands. We will start spreading this tale tomorrow. Ensure the staff at your estates corroborate every detail, if they value their pay." All nodded miserably, already envisioning the icy legal scrutiny that would follow even the most airtight rumor. The immediate crisis addressed, a fresh wave of anxiety washed over the committee. "But the matter of Darcy's promise," Collins stammered, twisting his lease papers. "I recall hearing from his mouth that he vowed he would return to take back his possession. He meant, of course, our estates, which he claims to possess." Oh, Wickham's face hardened. He had not forgotten the threat. He had merely dismissed it as bluster. Darcy had always treated legal disputes with cold authority, never physical force. "He will not succeed," Wickham asserted, though his voice lacked conviction. "He cannot simply march in and seize properties leased under valid tenancy agreements. That is the law." However, Wickham walked over to a heavy wooden cupboard and wrenched it open, revealing not documents, but a chaotic collection of obsolete arms, 2 rusty pistols, an antiquated blunderbuss, and 3 unwieldy fowling pieces intended for shooting pheasant, not men. "He is proud, arrogant, and relies on intimidating presence over due diligence," Wickham said, pulling out a pistol and checking the flintlock. "He expects us to melt away like snow in spring. He expects his authority will be enough. We must demonstrate that this time he is wrong." The other men stared at the weaponry with mounting dread. They were men of ledgers and gossip, not combat. "We are merely safeguarding our legally held interests, gentlemen," Wickham insisted, trying to imbue his preparation with legitimacy. "If a thief attempts to breach a leasehold property, one is fully entitled to defend it. We are not launching a war. We are reinforcing locks and bolting doors. Should Darcy's carriage appear, someone will fire a warning shot above his head." "A loud one." "A warning shot? With that?" Denny pointed skeptically at the blunderbuss, which looked more likely to injure the user than the target. "It matters not what it is fired with, Denny, but that it is fired by men determined to hold their ground. Remember, he regards us only as tenants. But we are armed. We are buying ourselves time. Time for the legal challenges we must now mount." Wickham repocketed the pistol and took a deep, calculating breath. The lie must be whispered across Meryton by sunset. The defenses must be erected by dawn. The absurdity of their situation? Professional schemers reduced to wielding rusty firearms to defend leases they held only through manipulation? Was lost beneath the fog of their shared desperation. They were defending annexations built on sand, preparing a pathetic stand against a man who possessed not only wealth and connection, but the legitimacy of a powerful, legally recognized marriage. "To your post, gentlemen," Wickham commanded, his voice ringing with forced purpose. When Darcy returns, and he will return, he must find Meryton not a welcome possession, but a fortress defended by men who believe, truly believe, that their leases are sacred. Now move. Chapter 20. The morning air in Darcy House in London was sharp and clean, filtered through the high windows of the dining parlor. A fire crackled merrily in the grate, casting a warm gold light over the mahogany table laid meticulously with silver and porcelain. Fitzwilliam Darcy, impeccable in a dark coat and cream waistcoat, buttered a piece of his toast with unhurried precision. He watched his wife across the table, admiring the intelligent animation in her eyes as she skimmed the morning's correspondence. "Good morning, my love," he said, setting down his knife. "You are contemplative this morning. Tell me, do you know what day of high festival this is?" Elizabeth looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. She had known her husband long enough to recognize the particular tone of controlled anticipation in his voice, a tone usually reserved for the settling of momentous estate business. "It is Michaelmas, Fitzwilliam," she answered promptly. "The 29th of September, the quarter day when rents are due, leases settle, and the courts convene. A day for audits and balances, I presume, which is certainly what occupies the mind of the master of Pemberley." Darcy inclined his head slightly. "You are perfectly accurate, down to the detail of the audit. But today is far more significant than the mere collection of quarterly rents. Today is the hinge upon which a very complex and long-standing matter of inherited duty turns." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, though still resonating with authority. "My ancestors, 100 years ago, set a firm date for the eventual transfer and repossession of those lands. They chose Michaelmas precisely for its symbolic weight as the day of legal closure and final reckoning." He paused, taking a sip of his tea, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth. "Today is that date. This morning we ride for Hertfordshire. We must be on the ground by evening, ready to execute the transfer of possession on the morrow." Elizabeth's expression shifted instantly from mild interest to sharp concern. She set down her letters, her usual playful ease, replaced it by severe gravity. "To Meryton today?" she repeated. "But how is that to be possible, Fitzwilliam? You speak of the Meryton leases, those properties that have been annexed by every unscrupulous hand in the county for years. The opposition to your father's claim has been fierce, and lately violently defended. Those tenants, or squatters as the case may be, have grown accustomed to their defiance. They will surely defend those leased holdings by force." She knew the history well. The moment Darcy attempted to enforce the final transfer, he risked a riot. Darcy watched her, acknowledging the validity of her concern in the steady intensity of his own eyes. There was no trace of doubt or hesitation in his answer. "Every contingency has been accounted for, Elizabeth, and the resistance, however violent they intended to be, will not materialize." He pushed his plate slightly away, resting his hands flat on the table. "This is not merely a legal matter to be handled by solicitors and constables. This is an undertaking of significant consequence, requiring absolute clarity and the demonstration of unanswerable authority." He permitted himself a rare, almost grim smile. "Colonel Fitzwilliam arrived from the North Road an hour before dawn and is currently seeing to the final preparations. He has not come alone. Richard brings with him his full troop, 100 disciplined soldiers of the line." Elizabeth gasped, a tiny, involuntary sound. 100 soldiers. This was not a negotiation. It was a military deployment. Her mind instantly pictured the scenes of the peaceful Hertfordshire countryside, now dominated by marching boots and muskets. "A troop of 100? She whispered. "Fitzwilliam, this is a vast show of force. Must we truly resolve this matter by such extremity?" "It is not extremity, my dear. It is foresight," Darcy corrected calmly. "The law is clear, but the opposition is deaf to the law. They understand one language only, the absolute superiority of force. If we ride in with 3 men, we will be mocked and repulsed instantly. If we ride in with a company of cavalry, led by an officer of His Majesty's army, there will be no resistance at all." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation and the commencement of the day's journey. "The soldiers will merely be present. ensuring the peace and confirming the possessory right. There shall be no violence, for the opposition will know they have no hope of prevailing. By the time the sun sets tonight, we will be established in the county, and by tomorrow the Meryton leases will belong to Pemberley uncontested. Richard will ensure it. He walked around the table and offered her his hand. Our carriage waits, and the troopers are already forming up in the yard. Chapter 21. The air in Meryton was thick, not with the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth, but with the metallic tang of military discipline and the pervasive, fine dust kicked up by hundreds of marching boots. It was the silence that was truly overwhelming. The assembly house, usually the source of muffled music, excited chatter, or post-market gossip, stood mute, its Georgian facade grim under the late afternoon sun. Below the pediment, 2 armed sentries stood motionless, their bayonets fixed, a brutal symbol of the transition from leisure to martial law. Darcy stood before the steps, a figure of uncompromising superiority in the meticulously tailored dark coat of the landed gentry, distinct yet aligned with the uniform surrounding him. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even bloodshed. Instead, the surrender had been instantaneous, a mass capitulation born of sheer terror when Colonel Fitzwilliam's vanguard had appeared over the ridge. They didn't even fire a warning shot, Fitzwilliam, Darcy murmured, his voice low, addressed to his cousin but intended for Elizabeth. Colonel Fitzwilliam, immaculate even after the forced march, adjusted the cuff of his scarlet tunic. They are farmers, Darcy, not grenadiers. They saw the scale of the operation, the artillery train, and understood the arithmetic. Why die for a 5-acre lease? He swept a professional eye over the quiet square, where the last of the defeated families, men, women, and children, were being ushered patiently into the assembly house. The structure is secure. All the tenants from the affected holdings are accounted for inside. Elizabeth held Darcy's arm, her grip tight enough to feel the corded muscle beneath the wool. She wore the rich pelisse of a prosperous mistress of a great estate, but her eyes, wide and unnervingly dark, were those of the local girl who knew the names of the families being marshaled. They look terribly frightened, Fitzwilliam, she observed, her voice barely audible. Fear is productive, Elizabeth, the colonel replied simply, without malice, merely stating a military fact. It prevents unnecessary violence. This entire operation was swift, bloodless, and absolute, exactly as your husband decreed it should be. Mr. Bennet sighed, the sound a soft, dry rasp of irony and exhaustion. He stood slightly apart, leaning heavily on his walking stick, observing the destruction of the local social fabric with the detached censure of an historian contemplating a predictable disaster. Meryton was ever a place of noisy frivolity, Mr. Bennet said, lifting his chin toward the grim assembly house. It seems that even its levity has been extinguished by this necessary, painful formality. I confess, Fitzwilliam, I find this display of power highly affecting. I had not conceived of the magnitude of the consequences when I merely thought of the consequences. Darcy placed his hand over Elizabeth's, anchoring her. He knew this was the hardest moment for her, seeing her former neighbors reduced to supplicants, all gathered in the very room where she had once laughed at his pride and refused his hand. It is not a formality, sir, Darcy said, addressing his father-in-law sharply. It is the establishment of structure. These holdings were leased under terms that promoted insolvency. I understand the ledger, Darcy, Mr. Bennet countered, his eyes twinkling dimly. I merely wonder if the ledger considers the cost of this particular silence. Darcy ignored the familial criticism. He offered his arm fully to Elizabeth. It is time. The magistrates are waiting inside to confirm the new tenure agreements and the reassignment protocols. We must ensure the legitimacy of the proceedings is upheld. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her chin lifting slightly, the sudden proud reflex of a woman preparing to face an ordeal. She was no longer Miss Bennet of Longbourn, powerless to stop the inevitable march of progress and capital. She was Mrs. Darcy of Pemberley, and she was entering the assembly house to stand beside the man who held the power of life and death, or at least the power of hearth and home, over the hundreds gathered inside. I only wish, Elizabeth murmured to Darcy as they ascended the stone steps, passing the unblinking sentries. that I could forget what the room looked like when the lanterns were lit and everyone was dancing. The floorboards of the Assembly House entrance hall groaned under the weight of their purposeful steps. The festive smells of punch and beeswax were replaced by the close, anxious odor of fear and unwashed bodies crammed too tightly together. They reached the double doors of the main ballroom. Fitzwilliam used a gloved hand to push them inward. The sight was devastating. The room, the epicenter of Meryton's social life, was packed. Hundreds of faces, pale and drawn, turned instantly toward the doors. They were seated on makeshift benches or huddled on the floor. Husbands protecting wives, mothers clutching children, all staring at the four figures framed in the doorway. The stern military commander, the cynical old squire, and at the center the man who held the writ of forfeiture, accompanied by his beautiful, powerful wife, who had once been one of their own. Darcy felt Elizabeth's hand tremble slightly on his sleeve. He squeezed it firmly, setting his jaw. He stepped over the threshold, pulling Elizabeth into the room that smelled of dread. The silence deepened, becoming absolute, the sound of history turning a sharp, unforgiving corner. Chapter 22. The Great Hall of Pemberley, usually reserved for grand balls or intimate family gatherings, hummed with a different kind of tension that gray autumn morning. Over 100 families, tenants for generations on the Darcy estates, sat or stood, their faces etched with a mixture of hope, anxiety, and a touch of indignation. They had been summoned by Mr. Darcy himself, a rare and rather unsettling occurrence. Their leases, some dating back beyond living memory, were set to expire today. Fitzwilliam Darcy, younger than many in the room, but bearing the weight of generations in his stern gaze, stood at the head of the room. His elegant form was unyielding, his expression serious. The morning light filtering through the tall windows seemed to cast him in stark relief against the ancient stone walls. He cleared his throat, and the murmur of nervous conversation died instantly. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the expansive space without effort. "I have gathered you here today for a matter of considerable importance to all present." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled faces. Many flinched under its intensity. As many of you are aware, the ownership of these estates, which include the lands you have leased, has recently been formally transferred. My father, the late Mr. Darcy, had, as you know, long since begun the process. However, as of this morning, the last legal transfers have been completed. I am now the sole and unquestionable owner of all the estates concerned, their lands and properties. A low rustle went through the room. While expected, the formal declaration still served to underscore the shift in power. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others simply stared at Darcy, trying to read his intentions. "Furthermore," Darcy continued, his voice unwavering, "all existing leasing contracts that link your families to these properties also expire today. These contracts, some of which were drawn up by my grand-grandfather, and all originally overseen by my father, have reached their natural conclusion. There were no provisions for automatic renewal." A collective gasp, a few stifled cries, and a wave of palpable alarm swept through the hall. Faces paled, hands flew to mouths, and a few women began to fan themselves frantically. This truly was the moment of reckoning they had feared. Darcy held up a hand, not to silence them, but to signify his continued explanation. From a leather-bound folio on the mahogany table beside him, he produced several formidable-looking documents. "For clarity, and to put any doubts to rest, I have here the official deeds of transfer of ownership on my person, legally attested and witnessed." He held them aloft briefly before placing them back down. "And here, copies of the master records for the leases, clearly indicating their expiry dates, which, as I stated, are today." He met their stunned silence with an unwavering gaze. "Now, to the matter of your continued tenancy." Every individual leaned forward, hanging on his every word. The air was thick with desperation and anticipation. "Over the past few months," Darcy explained, "many of you had sent to my solicitor applications for what we termed leasing debt canceling. These applications were an invitation for all current tenants to acknowledge the new era of ownership and to formally request a review of their arrangements in light of their expiring contracts. It was, in essence, an opportunity to confirm your willingness to continue under new terms and to signify your understanding of my new position as landlord. He paused, letting the words sink in. Some in the room looked suddenly relieved, others confused, and a significant number, particularly those from the more established and perhaps complacent families, looked utterly aghast. I have personally reviewed every single application, Darcy stated, his voice gaining a clipped, precise edge. And my decision is final. All those families who submitted these applications for a new arrangement, who showed due diligence and acknowledged the transition of the estate's ownership by seeking to regularize their position with me, will be validated. Your new contracts designed to ensure stability and fair terms are already prepared, and you will receive them by the end of the week. You may remain on your leased estates. A wave of joyous relief, soft but profound, swept through a portion of the room. Heads nodded, tears welled in eyes, and hushed thanks were whispered. But then Darcy's gaze hardened, sweeping over the remaining, unmoving figures. However, he continued, his voice dropping to a lower, more chilling register, those families who did not send applications for leasing debt canceling, by your inaction, you have effectively refused to acknowledge my right of possession and the expiry of your former agreements. You have chosen to ignore the clear invitation to engage with the new landlord of Pemberley. This cannot stand. A collective gasp, louder and more distressed than before, erupted from the other half of the room. A portly gentleman spluttered, "Refused your right, sir? It was an optional application. We've been here for generations." Darcy's eyes, usually so restrained, flashed. Optional for those who wish to remain, but mandatory for those who wish to demonstrate their respect for the new order. Your choice by not applying clearly indicated to me that you did not see the necessity of engaging with your new landlord on these matters. You effectively asserted that your old arrangements superseded my new authority. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. And therefore, those who did not apply and thus demonstrated their refusal to acknowledge my possession right will be sent away. The hall erupted. Cries of outrage, indignant protests, and heartbroken sobs mingled in a cacophony of despair. "Impossible! Unfair! We'll be ruined," Darcy remained unyielding. "Last year I warned you personally, but you did not take my words seriously. Instead, you claimed to be owners of those estates and thus became guilty of inaction. You will be given 1 month to vacate your properties. Provisions will be made for an orderly departure, and assistance offered for the transport of your goods to a destination of your choosing, within reason. My estate managers will provide you with the necessary details." He looked at the tumultuous crowd, his expression unreadable. For Fitzwilliam Darcy, this was not an act of cruelty, but one of establishing firm, clear boundaries. The old ways, the informal understandings, were now gone. A new era, one of stringent order and acknowledgement of authority, had begun in Meryton. He had drawn his line in the sand, and the consequences of crossing it or ignoring it had just become devastatingly clear. Chapter 23. The air in the great hall of the estate office was thick and cold. Despite the late autumn chill pressing against the window panes, the silence imposed by the 60 assembled families was absolute and heavy with defeat. They stood, a collection of erstwhile tenants, their faces pallid, their resentment muted by fear. Their livelihoods, the estates they had leased, were gone, the consequence of a foolish defiance incited by a man whose charisma had masked his malice. Fitzwilliam Darcy stood upon a low mahogany platform, his posture unyielding, dressed in severe black broadcloth that lent him the air of a prosecuting magistrate rather than a landlord. He had listened to their pitiful pleas and explanations for 3 hours, and now it was his turn to deliver the final judgment. "You have claimed ignorance," Darcy began, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceiling room. "You have claimed coercion, and you have claimed the hardship of circumstance. I neither wholly believe nor wholly disbelieve these excuses. What remains undisputed is that you attempted, as one collective, to withhold rents impede the functions of my bailiffs, and challenge the legal right of ownership established by generations of my family. A woman near the front, Mrs. Gibbs, opened her mouth to protest, but a sharp glance from Darcy silenced her. "Let us speak plainly of the instigator," he continued, folding his hands behind his back. "The man who preyed upon your anxieties, who promised you rights he had no power to grant, and who encouraged you to commit acts of near sedition against your lawful landlord, Mr. George Wickham." Darcy leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "Mr. Wickham's crimes are not merely financial, they are political. He did not ask you to simply negotiate. He urged you to rise. He provided the rhetoric of revolution, armed defiance against the established order." He paused, letting the severity of the charge sink into the minds of those who now risked ruin. "Therefore," Darcy announced, his tone shifting to the measured weight of a final decree, "the man who instigated this disorder, Mr. George Wickham, will be given into the hands of the appropriate authorities. He will be accused not simply of breach of contract or default of debt, but of sedition and conspiracy to incite open rebellion. The law will find its course with him, and it will be a severe one, to show that such malice against the security of property and good governance will not be tolerated in this county." A ripple of fear and awe swept through the room. They understood the difference between a broken contract and a charge of rebellion. The latter meant transportation, or worse. Darcy then moved to address the fate of the families themselves. "Now, for the matter of those of you whose leases are hereby terminated, you are, by law, indebted to me. The unpaid rents for many decades, the outstanding repair fees, and the costs incurred in recovering the use of the estates are all legally payable. Were I merely a landlord seeking punitive retribution, I would demand these sums, and the ruin of many of your families would be complete. You would face debtor's prison, and your children would be scattered to the parishes." He met their frightened gazes, allowing them to feel the precipice on which they stood. "However," Darcy stated, his voice softening just enough to imply a profound, costly concession, "I am also aware that many of you acted out of genuine, if misplaced, desperation, manipulated by a talented villain. I will not compound the ruin he has already inflicted upon you." He took a decisive step back. "I have chosen to show mercy. To those families not qualified to continue their tenure, I will not demand the payment of your debts of leasing. The outstanding sums are forgiven. The legal actions concerning debt are nullified. You will leave the properties free of financial entanglement with me, able to seek new, humble lives without the shadow of the Marshalsea hanging over you." A collective gasp of astonishment broke the polished silence. It was a reprieve beyond anything they had dared hope for. They were homeless, yes, but not utterly destroyed. "You must vacate the premises within 4 weeks," Darcy concluded, cutting off any nascent expressions of gratitude before they could begin. "Understand that this mercy is an act of forbearance, not weakness. The properties are no longer yours, and the situation permits no delay." He then delivered the final, crushing certainty that sealed the door on their return. "The estates that will now become free have not been left vacant. I am a man who prepares for eventualities. For the past month I have selected, vetted, and finalized arrangements with new tenants of demonstrable stability and means. They have already undersigned comprehensive leasing contracts. They are not rebels, they are not agitators, and they are expecting to take possession." Darcy glanced toward the windows, a gesture signifying the immutable passage of time. "They will arrive," he announced, "in precisely 4 weeks." The finality of the statement was absolute. The families had lost their homes, but they had saved their freedom and their fortunes. Darcy had extracted his justice, the exile of the families and the imminent destruction of Wickham, and purchased his peace at the cost of his own capital, cementing his authority through an act of terrifying, calculated clemency. The tenants began to file out, not with the angry murmurs of the defeated, but with the stunned, quiet resignation of those who had been judged, found wanting, and then miraculously spared the ultimate penalty. Chapter 24, The late afternoon sun, mellow and golden, slanted through the drawing room windows at Longbourn, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows across the comfortable, if somewhat worn furniture. 3 months had passed since the tumultuous events that had, against all odds, united Fitzwilliam Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, and placed Darcy in the position of owner of many estates bordering the Meryton lands. They sat together now, Elizabeth embroidering a small handkerchief with a surprisingly intricate design, Darcy engrossed in a financial ledger, the shared silence one of easy companionship. Darcy closed the book with a soft thud, leaning back in his chair and stretching his long legs towards the hearth, where a small fire crackled cheerfully against the evening chill. "Everything seems now to be in order, Elizabeth," he said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "My estates around Meryton, though a new acquisition, seem to be taken good care of. The families that have leased them have settled into their new agreements without further complaint. Indeed, a genuine peace has returned." He looked at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It feels as though the last few months of, shall we say, adjustments are finally behind us." Elizabeth paused, her needle hovering over the delicate fabric, her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Peace, yes," she murmured, her voice thoughtful. "I believe you are right where the estates themselves are concerned. But tell me, Fitzwilliam, what of those other families, the ones who had not accepted your rights as the owner and consequently were dismissed?" Darcy's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious, almost businesslike expression. He picked up a stray thread from his waistcoat, examining it with a careful precision. "Ah, yes," he mused, recalling the names. "As far as I have heard, my dear, all of them had found some places to live. Naturally," he added, his gaze returning to her, "it would not be with such income or comfort as before. Their refusal to acknowledge the legal transfer of ownership left me with little choice, I regret to say. But they are not destitute, I am assured." He saw the flicker in her eyes, a subtle clouding that told him his answer, while factual and logically sound, had not entirely satisfied the warmth of her conscience. It was a trait he had come to admire, even if it sometimes complicated his more straightforward calculations. "Not destitute, perhaps," Elizabeth said slowly, "but diminished. It is one thing to achieve order, Fitzwilliam, and another to secure genuine tranquility for all involved. I hope their new situations are not too harsh." She sighed and then, giving a small shake of her head. "But you are right, it is not a matter for my fretfulness now." She met his gaze, a more cheerful smile returning. "And you said everything is settled? No more urgent matters calling you to meetings or correspondence?" Darcy seized the change in subject with a renewed lightness. "None, my love. Absolutely none of consequence. Which brings me to my next point." He leaned forward, taking her hand gently in his. "It would be the right time to travel, to our home, to Pemberley, and there, with no more estate dealings of Meryton or recalcitrant tenants, we may truly begin to enjoy the life that awaits us." Elizabeth's hand tightened in his. The thought of Pemberley, of a life free from the constraints of their recent past, of beginning their shared future in that magnificent place, brought a genuine warmth to her heart. She smiled, allowing the lingering faint unease about the dismissed families to recede into the corners of her mind, at least for the moment. Darcy had done what was necessary, however difficult, and perhaps true peace would indeed be found, not just in order, but in a shared life built on understanding, even if their perspectives sometimes diverged. "Pemberley," she echoed softly. "Yes, Fitzwilliam, I believe it would."